Tonight we walk beneath a darkening sky toward the place where Rome made death speak, not in whispers, not in private, not behind walls where grief could gather itself in dignity. Rome made death speak in the open air, beside roads, outside gates, on bare hills where travellers, merchants, soldiers, mothers, children, slaves, and strangers could see what imperial power meant when it had no further patience for mercy. There, under the hard light of the Mediterranean sun, stood the wood, a post fixed into the earth, a beam lifted across it, a human body fastened to it with rope, iron, or both. Around it, dust, flies, blood drying black, the dull murmur of a crowd, the metallic patience of soldiers who had performed this duty before and would perform it again. Crucifixion was not simply execution, it was a message carved into flesh. To the Roman mind, death alone was not always enough. A sword could kill quickly, poison could silence, strangling could end a life within moments. But crucifixion did something colder. It stretched dying into an event. It turned the condemned into a living warning. It made the body become a signpost, telling every passerby that Rome owned not only the land, the laws, and the roads, but the final hours of those who defied it. And yet the darkest truth is this: many victims did not die at once. They survived the first agony. They survived the flogging, though the skin of the back might hang in torn strips. They survived the forced march, though the legs trembled and the mouth filled with dust. They survived the fastening of wrists and feet, though the nerves burned like fire. They survived the first hour on the cross, then another, sinking into a region of suffering where time no longer behaved like time, where every breath became labour, and every movement became a negotiation with pain. How did a human body endure such torment? The answer is not simple. It lies at the meeting point of anatomy, Roman law, military discipline, public theatre, and the terrible resilience of flesh. It also lies in the gaps of evidence, where the ancient world, as it often does, leaves us answerless, adrift to ponder. Archaeology gives us fragments, but powerful ones. In the 20th century, excavators in the region once ruled by Rome uncovered the remains of a man whose heel bone still held the trace of an iron nail. The discovery shook assumptions, because crucifixion, though described in texts, rarely leaves clear marks in the ground. Wood decays. Iron is removed or reused. Bodies of the condemned were often discarded without honour. Soil, scavengers, weather, and time erase the evidence. Still, through stratigraphic excavation, careful burial study, and osteological analysis, the ancient punishment steps partly out of the darkness. A nail through bone tells us what literature cannot fully convey. It tells us that Roman cruelty was not metaphor. It was engineered, physical, and exact. The written sources are equally grim. Roman historians, philosophers, and legal writers knew crucifixion as the lowest and most shameful of deaths. It was associated with slaves, rebels, bandits, deserters, pirates, and provincials whose lives did not carry the protection of elite status. A Roman citizen, in ordinary circumstances, he was not meant to die this way. The cross belonged to the humiliated, the conquered, the disposable. This is one of the great truths of crucifixion. It was social death before biological death. The condemned was stripped, mocked, displayed, raised above the earth, yet denied honour, alive, but treated as already outside the human community. The crowd saw not merely a dying man or woman, but a person deliberately transformed into an object lesson. Rome understood spectacle. It understood roads, stone, ritual, uniforms, banners, and the psychology of fear. Crucifixion was theatre with a corpse as its final curtain. But behind that theatre was a body fighting to remain alive. A body deprived of water, a body damaged by blood loss, a body exposed to heat by day and cold by night, a body whose arms were stretched, whose chest struggled, whose legs spasmed, whose shoulders burned. Every breath might require the victim to push upward, dragging torn feet or strained limbs against the fastening points, just to lift the rib cage enough for air. Some died quickly, because the scourging had already brought them near collapse. Others endured longer because the executioners chose a method that prolonged suffering. Ropes could hold a victim for days. Nails could intensify trauma. A small support beneath the feet or body could delay death, not out of kindness, but to lengthen the display. In such details, the real horror begins. Crucifixion was not random violence. It was controlled violence. It belonged to a system. Soldiers knew where to take the condemned. Magistrates knew when to pronounce the sentence. Crowds knew what the sight meant. Families knew when hope had ended. The empire had turned pain into procedure. And still, amid all this, the victim remained human. This is what history must never forget. Beneath the legal category, beneath the charge of rebellion or theft or desertion, there was a face, a voice, a childhood, a memory of water, bread, warmth, and sleep. There were hands that once worked, eyes that once looked upon morning, lungs that once breathed without thought. Rome tried to make the condemned into warnings, but the body on the cross remained a person until the final breath left it. The ancient world was not ignorant. Its people were not crude shadows stumbling towards civilization. They knew honor, they knew terror, they knew the value of public memory. They knew how power could be staged in their courts, camps, cities, and temples. Gods and mortals seemed to walk the same earth, and punishment could feel like both law and ritual, both politics and sacrifice. That is why crucifixion still haunts the imagination, not only because it was painful. Many deaths are painful. Crucifixion haunts because it reveals how carefully human beings can design suffering when authority, fear, and contempt join hands. It shows civilization at its most paradoxical. Roads paved, laws written, armies disciplined, aqueducts shining in the distance, and beyond the city gate a man slowly dying on wood. Tonight we enter that contradiction. We will not rush through it. We will stand in the dust of the execution ground and examine each stage with care. The sentence, the scourge, the road, the beam, the nail, the rope, the breath, the crowd, the waiting, the silence. For still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The exact posture of many victims is unknown. The number of hours they endured is often lost. The private words spoken from the cross have vanished into wind. Only fragments remain: a bone, a passage, a law, a scar in the memory of civilization. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, as the night gathers around you, where in the world you're listening from, and what the local time is where you are. Long before Roman soldiers raised their posts beside the roads of Italy, Sicily, Judea, North Africa, and Gaul, the ancient world had already learned that death could be made visible. In the earlier cities of kings and temple scribes, punishment was not always hidden. It belonged to the gate, the wall, the market road, and the outer field where the living passed close enough to understand. The body of the condemned could become a boundary marker between obedience and ruin. It could declare that the ruler's hand reached beyond the palace, beyond the city wall, beyond even the last breath of the defeated. In the riverlands of Mesopotamia, where clay tablets hardened beneath the sun and reeds whispered along the canals. Rulers carved their victories into stone. Captives were shown bound. Enemies were trampled beneath royal feet. Bodies were displayed in ways meant to outlive the cries of the battlefield. The purpose was not merely to kill a foe, but to fix the memory of domination into the world itself. The defeated body became political language. Across the empires of the Near East, impalement and suspension were known with particular dread. Assyrian royal inscriptions speak with chilling confidence of conquered enemies lifted upon stakes, their bodies transformed into monuments of imperial wrath. Reliefs from palace walls present war not as confusion, but as order imposed through terror. Cities fall, prisoners kneel, soldiers advance in ranks. Above them all stands the king, chosen by the gods, guardian of cosmic order, destroyer of rebellion. To modern eyes, such images are difficult to endure. Yet to ancient rulers, they were arguments. They told subject peoples that revolt did not end at defeat. It continued into dishonour. It continued into exposure. It continued through the body's helplessness beneath the sky. Here, in these older traditions, we see the shadow that would one day fall across Roman crucifixion. The essential idea was already alive. A punishment could be slow, public, vertical, and humiliating. The condemned could be lifted from the earth not in glory, but in disgrace. The body could be displayed between the realm of the living and the realm of carrion birds, belonging fully to neither. The Persians, too, were remembered in Greek accounts for punishments involving stakes, poles, and suspended bodies. Whether every story was precise or sharpened by enemy imagination is difficult to know, for ancient writers often described foreign cruelty in ways that flattered their own customs. Still, behind the rhetoric, something real can be felt. Great empires had discovered that execution could function as frontier policy. On the edge of imperial control, where garrisons were thin and rebellion always possible, terror saved manpower. A single displayed body could speak louder than 100 written decrees. The Greeks inherited, adapted, and described forms of suspension and exposure. In the world of city-states, punishment varied widely. Some communities preferred the sword, others the hemlock cup, others forms of binding, stoning, throwing from heights, or exposure after death. The Greek imagination often associated civilized punishment with restraint, yet Greek history was not gentle. War between cities could be merciless. Slaves, traitors, pirates, and besieged enemies might discover that the boundary between justice and vengeance was fragile. Among Greek speakers, the vocabulary surrounding suspension, staking, and fastening was fluid. Ancient terms did not always describe a single precise structure. A pole, a stake, a tree, a beam, a frame. Any of these could become an instrument of shame. This matters because crucifixion did not begin as one fixed design. It was not born fully formed, like a machine drawn by an engineer. It developed from older habits of binding, lifting, piercing, displaying, leaving the condemned to die. The Mediterranean was a sea of exchange. Ships carried grain, oil, wine, slaves, soldiers, metalwork, myths, disease, and techniques of rule. Punishments travelled too. The Phoenician and Carthaginian worlds, masters of ports and trade routes, stood at a crossroads between the Near East, North Africa, Iberia, and the central Mediterranean. Roman writers later believed Carthage made use of crucifixion, especially in military discipline. A defeated general, a failed commander, a man accused of disastrous weakness, might suffer a death intended to cleanse public shame through public pain. Rome watched Carthage for centuries, sometimes with envy, sometimes with hatred, always with attention. When Rome began as a small city beside the Tiber, shaded by hills and guarded by its ancestral gods, its punishments were severe but not yet imperial in scale. Early Roman law knew beating, binding, burning, drowning, throwing from the Tarpeian rock, and forms of capital punishment that carried ritual meaning. The household itself contained power over dependents, the master over the slave, the father over the family, the magistrate over the citizen, the commander over the soldier. But as Rome expanded, its punishments expanded with it. Conquest changed everything. A city that ruled only nearby fields could punish as a community. A republic that ruled seas, mountains, provinces, mines, plantations, roads, and millions of unwilling subjects required punishments that could travel. Punishments that needed little explanation. Punishments that could be performed by soldiers far from home. Punishments that required no grand temple, no elaborate court, no hidden chamber. A post, a beam, rope, iron, and men trained to obey orders. This was the terrible simplicity of crucifixion. It could be improvised from the materials of empire. Wood was everywhere, even if costly in arid lands. Rope could be carried, nails could be forged. Roads already led to the killing places. The condemned could be displayed where movement itself became an audience, along routes used by traders, pilgrims, tax collectors, and troops. Roman genius often lay in adaptation rather than invention. The Romans took religious forms, artistic styles, military methods, laws, gods, and technologies from others, then hardened them into systems. Crucifixion followed the same pattern. Older cultures had lifted and displayed the defeated. Rome made that practice administrative. It became part of the imperial grammar of fear. Yet even in this deep past, the evidence resists easy certainty. Archaeology offers little, for the dead of such punishments were rarely granted careful burial. Radiocarbon dating may place remains within a broad historical horizon, but without distinctive trauma. The method cannot tell us how a person died. Stratigraphic excavation may reveal a grave, a pit, or a refuse layer. But the silence of bone remains profound when iron has been removed and wood has vanished into soil. Lithic analysis helps us understand stone tools in older worlds, but for crucifixion it is metal, timber, and damaged bone that matter most, and those traces are often gone. Still, the pattern emerges. Across ancient kingdoms, death could be made vertical. Shame could be raised above eye level. The human form could be turned into a warning beneath the sun. By the time Rome perfected crucifixion, the world had already prepared the stage. Kings who displayed enemies, empires that governed through fear, cities that punished slaves without pity, armies that learned discipline through spectacle, and crowds that understood what a body on a post was meant to say. The cross did not come from nowhere. It rose from centuries of imperial imagination, from scorched deserts, river plains, harbour towns, siege camps, and conquered roads where power learned to speak through suffering, and still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the first victim fastened to timber in the manner later remembered as crucifixion. We do not know the first crowd that watched such a death unfold. We do not know which ancient executioner first understood that the body, suspended and exposed, could become a message more enduring than the sentence itself. Only the echo remains, the old world discovering again and again that fear could be built from wood. Rome discovered fear not as an accident, but as an instrument. It found fear in the slave barracks before dawn, where bodies rose from straw and darkness to labour for masters whose names might never be spoken with affection. It found fear in the mining tunnels of Spain, where men descended into the earth and breathed dust until their lungs became as heavy as stone. It found fear in the fields of Sicily, where gangs of enslaved workers bent beneath the heat, guarded by overseers and punished for fatigue as if exhaustion were rebellion. It found fear in army camps where discipline had to be sharper than hunger, sharper than homesickness, sharper than the temptation to run. Rome did not merely conquer territories, it managed human beings. Some obeyed because they believed in Roman order. Some obeyed because they profited from it. Some obeyed because they had no choice. The Republic and later the Empire stretched over peoples who spoke different languages, honoured different gods, planted different crops, buried their dead in different ways, and remembered different kings. A system so vast could not rely only on affection. It needed roads, taxes, soldiers, records, alliances, rewards, and punishments that every province could understand. Crucifixion became one of those punishments. Its terror lay partly in its class. The cross was not usually reserved for the honoured citizen standing inside the protections of Roman identity. It belonged to those Rome saw as beneath the full dignity of law: the slave, the rebel, the bandit, the pirate, the foreign insurgent, the deserter who betrayed the discipline of the legion, the provincial troublemaker whose death could teach a village the price of defiance. To die on a cross was to be told that one's body was no longer private. The sword could still belong to the soldier. The poison cup could still belong to a philosopher. The ordered suicide could still preserve a remnant of status among elites. But crucifixion stripped status away. It was not merely a sentence upon life. It was a sentence upon reputation, family, memory, and burial. It declared that the condemned had fallen below the ordinary rituals by which the dead passed into remembrance. In a world where honour mattered with almost physical force, such disgrace was devastating. The Roman social imagination was layered like a city built on older foundations. At the top stood those with ancestry, property, citizenship, office, military glory, and public voice. Beneath them stood freed people, foreigners, labourers, dependents, and the vast enslaved population whose lives could be bought, sold, inherited, branded, punished, and worked to death. The cross belonged to this vertical world. It expressed hierarchy in wood and flesh. A man raised on the cross was physically elevated, yet socially lowered into the dust. This contradiction was part of the cruelty. The victim was lifted where all could see, but only so that everyone might look down on him. His nakedness or near nakedness was not incidental. His helpless posture was not incidental. His exposure to mockery was not incidental. Rome understood that humiliation could wound beyond the flesh, and crucifixion was humiliation prolonged until the body failed. The slave system made crucifixion especially useful. Slavery in Rome was not marginal. It was woven into households, farms, workshops, mines, ships, schools, estates, and public works. Some enslaved people served close to power and might live with relative comfort. Others endured brutal labour in conditions where death was expected, and replacement was easier than mercy, because enslaved people were everywhere. Slave resistance haunted the Roman imagination. A whispered plot, a runaway group, a murdered master, a rural uprising. Any of these could seem to threaten the foundation of the order. The memory of slave revolts sharpened that fear. When large numbers of enslaved people rose in rebellion, Rome responded with overwhelming force. The most famous uprising associated with Spartacus revealed a nightmare at the heart of Roman society. Men trained for violence, denied freedom, and driven beyond endurance could become an army. When such revolts were crushed, punishment had to do more than remove surviving rebels. It had to warn every slave who heard the story. It had to travel from field to kitchen, from mine to market, from estate to city street. The road itself became a scroll of terror. Bodies fastened along a highway transformed movement into instruction. Travellers did not need a magistrate to explain the meaning. The sight said everything. This is what happens when the lowly rise. This is what happens when property speaks as if it were free. This is what happens when Rome is forced to remember you. Crucifixion also served the provinces. In conquered lands, Rome faced communities with deep traditions of local identity. Some accepted Roman rule because it brought stability, trade, and opportunity. Others hated the tax collector, the garrison, the foreign official, the collaborator in fine clothing. Rebellion often began not as a grand military campaign, but as a knot of anger, a village refusing tribute, a band attacking roads, a prophet gathering followers, a local leader invoking older freedoms. For such unrest, crucifixion was a language of occupation. It did not require the condemned to be understood as an enemy soldier worthy of battlefield respect. It labelled him criminal, bandit, disturber of peace. By choosing the cross, Rome could turn political resistance into public degradation. The rebel didn't die as a patriot in Roman eyes. He died as a warning nailed into the landscape. This is why the punishment appears again and again in frontier regions and troubled provinces. Wherever imperial control felt uneasy, the cross could rise. It might stand near a city gate, beside a road, outside a camp, or on a visible height. It occupied the border between settlement and wilderness, law and outlawry, civic life and the place where bodies were left to weather. Pirates too could meet this fate. The Mediterranean was a world of ships, harbours, grain routes, military convoys, and coastal towns. Piracy threatened not only trade but Roman pride. A pirate captured by Roman authority was more than a thief at sea. He was an insult to order. Crucifixion turned that insult back upon the offender. It said that the sea itself, wild and shifting though it was, had fallen beneath Roman judgment. Deserters and soldiers presented another problem. The Roman army depended upon discipline so intense that individual fear had to be redirected into collective obedience. A soldier might face death in battle, but he also faced punishment from his own commanders if he abandoned duty. Military discipline was a theatre of severity, decimation, beating, dismissal in shame, and execution reminded soldiers that the army was not merely a profession, it was a machine into which the body had been pledged. For the deserter, especially one of low status or auxiliary rank, crucifixion could transform betrayal into spectacle. The message was inward as much as outward. Other soldiers saw what happened when the chain of command broke. The army that crucified enemies could also turn its terror upon those within its own ranks. Yet it would be wrong to imagine crucifixion only as mindless savagery. It was worse than that. It was rational within the logic of empire, coldly rational, economical, public, memorable, adaptable. It used the victim's own body as the medium of punishment. It required the cooperation of only a few trained men. It could last long enough for news to spread. It linked crime, pain, shame, and visibility into a single scene. Rome was not alone in cruelty, but Rome gave cruelty roads. Stone roads carried soldiers to the edges of rebellion. They carried merchants past the bodies of the condemned. They carried rumours from province to province, the same infrastructure that moved grain, letters, taxes, and law also moved terror. This is one reason crucifixion became so powerful in Roman hands. It belonged not only to execution grounds, but to the entire architecture of rule. The victim's survival within agony made the punishment more effective. A corpse warned. A living sufferer commanded attention. A body still breathing, still shifting, still groaning, still struggling against thirst and suffocation, created a scene from which the eye recoiled yet returned. The crowd witnessed not a moment but a process. The condemned became a clock of pain, measuring imperial authority in breaths, spasms, and silence. This is the dark heart of the matter. Rome didn't always seek swift death. Swift death could be merciful, efficient, almost forgettable. Crucifixion was designed to delay forgetting. It gave the public time to gather, time to laugh, time to pity, time to fear, time to carry the image home. In that drawn-out interval, the state entered the imagination of every witness. Children might remember it for life. Slaves might dream of it in terror. Rebels might measure their courage against it. Families might learn that grief itself had to be cautious, for too much mourning over a condemned enemy could invite suspicion. Even silence became political beneath the cross. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot count the number of victims. We cannot hear the voices of most of the condemned. The literate world preserved the perspectives of governors, historians, moralists, satirists, and theologians far more often than the cries of slaves and rebels. Genomic data may one day tell us more about population movement, ancestry, disease, and kinship among the buried dead of Roman lands. But it cannot recover fear as it passed through the throat in the final hours. Stratigraphic excavation may uncover pits and bones, but not the full weight of a crowd's gaze. What remains is the pattern of power. Rome discovered that fear could be made durable when attached to shame. It discovered that punishment could govern those who never met a magistrate. It discovered that a body displayed in pain could become an imperial announcement more persuasive than polished marble. It discovered that survival itself, when trapped inside agony, could serve the ruler. And so the cross became one of Rome's most terrible inventions of meaning, not merely a method of death, but a public grammar of domination, written in timber, iron, thirst, and time. The sentence began not with wood, but with a voice, somewhere in the controlled space of Roman authority, beneath a roofed hall in a military camp, before a governor's tribunal, or in the crowded pressure of a provincial court. The condemned stood under the gaze of men who possessed the right to decide how life would end. The air might have smelled of sweat, dust, leather, ink, and hot stone. Outside, the city moved as cities always move. Donkeys brayed, vendors called, wheels struck paving stones. Somewhere nearby, bread was being baked, water was being drawn, children were arguing in alleys, and ordinary life continued with cruel indifference. Inside the place of judgment, everything narrowed. Roman sentencing was not merely administrative, it was ceremonial power. The magistrate, governor, prefect, or military commander did not need to shout to be feared. His authority lay in position, symbols, attendants, documents, soldiers, and the expectation that his words would become action. Law in the Roman world could appear majestic, orderly, and ancient. But for the vulnerable it could also feel like a blade wrapped in parchment. To be sentenced to crucifixion was to hear the state claim the body completely. The condemned person might have been accused of robbery on the roads, rebellion against a governor, murder of a master, desertion from a unit, piracy at sea, or sedition in a province where fear already ran close beneath the surface. Some trials were formal, some were rushed, some were shaped by local politics, informers, patronage, resentment, or the desire to restore public calm through one spectacular punishment. The Roman world was not one single courtroom. Justice varied by place, status, urgency, and the identity of the accused. A wealthy citizen could appeal, delay, negotiate, call upon patrons, and sometimes turn punishment aside. A poor provincial might have little more than his own voice. A slave might have no recognized voice at all, except under conditions of interrogation where pain could be mistaken for truth. This was one of the most frightening aspects of Roman punishment. The law knew rank. A sentence was never simply a sentence. It revealed where a person stood in the great hierarchy of the world. Two people might commit similar acts, yet meet different deaths. One might be exiled, one might be beheaded, one might be sent to the mines, one might be thrown to beasts in the arena, one might be crucified beside a road where dogs nosed the dust beneath his feet. Status-shaped suffering. The pronouncement itself was brief compared with what it unleashed. A few words, perhaps entered into record, perhaps shouted by an official, perhaps repeated by soldiers to those outside, and the condemned crossed an invisible threshold. There was no longer a case to argue, no longer a future to bargain with. The person became the property of the execution process. In some places, a written notice might be prepared declaring the crime. This notice could be carried or displayed so that the crowd understood the reason for punishment. Rome was skilled at turning death into information. A condemned man was not only dying, he was being labelled. His charge followed him like a second wound. Rebel, robber, slave, traitor, disturber. The exact words mattered less than the public lesson they carried. The court did not merely condemn, it organised humiliation. The condemned might be stripped of clothing, ornaments, belt, tools, and tokens of identity. These items mattered. In the ancient world, dress spoke strongly. A tunic, a cloak, a military belt, a mark of citizenship, the garments of a trade, the cloth of a household, all helped locate a person within society. To remove them was to peel away more than fabric. It was to make the body socially naked before it became physically exposed. Then came custody. Soldiers or attendants took hold of the condemned. Hands might be bound, arms pulled behind the back, a rope fixed to the wrists or neck. The body, still technically alive and capable of resistance, was managed as an object that might struggle, fall, spit, curse, faint, plead, or attempt escape. The execution squad was not improvised from sentimental men. It required people accustomed to force. They knew how to drag, strike, lift, and restrain. They knew how to make a living person move toward a place no living person wished to go. In military settings, the chain of command sharpened the atmosphere. Orders moved downward. No one needed to ask whether the condemned deserved pity. The sentence had answered that. The soldier's task was performance, not judgment. Rome depended on this separation. One man declared death, another carried the whip, another prepared the wood, another fixed the body. In this division of labour, responsibility became dispersed, and cruelty could proceed with clean hands in many directions. Yet the condemned heard everything: the shift in tone, the scrape of sandals, the laughter of bystanders outside, the murmur when the sentence spread, the clink of metal, the coarse command to stand straight, the first hand closing on the arm. Such moments are almost entirely absent from official history. Yet they are where the human terror begins most sharply. Before blood, before nails, before suffocation, there is recognition. The mind understands that the world has changed and will not change back. Some begged, some cursed, some stood silent. Some may have called upon gods, ancestors, family, comrades, or the justice of a cause. Some may have collapsed inward, already stunned by the knowledge that the body was about to become public property. A few, strengthened by belief or rage, may have tried to turn the sentence into testimony. But Rome usually controlled the stage. The prisoner could speak, yet the soldiers controlled movement. The crowd controlled noise. The magistrate controlled meaning. A condemned person might be mocked even before the first wound. Mockery mattered because it broke the bridge between victim and witness. To laugh at the condemned was to join the state, to place oneself safely among the living and obedient. The crowd could be uncertain, cruel, frightened, curious, or divided. Some came because spectacle drew them. Some came because they had business nearby. Some came because punishment interrupted the day like a public festival of dread. Others watched from doorways, unwilling to come close but unable to look away. The Roman authorities understood this human weakness. Public punishment feeds on attention. It requires witnesses to complete its meaning. Without witnesses, crucifixion still kills. But with witnesses, it governs. The sentence pronounced in a court travelled outward through bodies, voices, and eyes. A man condemned for rebellion became a warning to the restless. A slave condemned for violence became a warning to households. A bandit condemned for robbery became a warning to roads. Each category of crime was turned into a lesson for a particular audience. This is why the route from sentence to execution could matter as much as the execution itself. A private transfer would have hidden the lesson. A public passage exposed it. The condemned moved through spaces of daily life so that daily life could absorb the message. The bakery, the fountain, the market stall, the city gate, the guard post, the roadside shrine. Each became part of the ceremony. Ordinary places were stained by extraordinary terror. The condemned was made to pass through the world one last time, not as a participant, but as a warning. There is an almost unbearable intimacy in that thought. A person might see a familiar street, a wall once leaned upon in shade, a doorway once entered freely, a vendor once bargained with, a patch of sky between rooftops, and know that every sight had become farewell. The senses, sharpened by fear, might gather details with terrible clarity: the smell of fish, the heat of stone, the buzzing of insects, the roughness of rope, the taste of iron in the mouth where a lip had split. Roman procedure, armed, for all its hardness, could not prevent the condemned from being human inside the ritual. Every execution had two histories. The official history said a criminal was punished. The hidden history was the collapse of one person's world. In many cases, the sentence also affected the family. Relatives might be warned away, permitted to follow at a distance, or left ignorant until rumour reached them. For those of low status, grief itself could be dangerous. To mourn a rebel too publicly might appear sympathetic to rebellion. To claim the body of a condemned slave might require permission from owners or officials. To show tenderness in the face of state terror was not always simple. Love had to move carefully around power. Legal condemnation also stripped time of its ordinary shape. Usually the future opens in small assumptions: the next meal, the next errand, the next night of sleep, the next season of harvest, the next visit from a friend. The sentence crushed all such assumptions. Time narrowed into a corridor. The condemned no longer moved toward tomorrow, but toward the place prepared outside the city, the place where timber waited. Yet this narrowing was useful to Rome. It produced submission, disorientation, and spectacle. The condemned might be exhausted before the final punishment truly began. Fear itself weakens the body, the heart races, the mouth dries, the stomach knots, knees tremble, muscles lose steadiness, breath becomes shallow. A person can begin dying in the mind before the body is formally attacked. Such psychological breaking was not separate from crucifixion. It was part of it. The sentence pronounced was the first nail, though no iron had yet touched the flesh. It fixed the victim inside a story Rome had written. It told the crowd how to see. It told the soldiers what to do. It told the condemned that personal identity had been swallowed by public punishment. From that moment, every gesture served the design of terror. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No excavation can fully recover the voice of the magistrate as it sounded across a crowded court. No radiocarbon dating can measure the final instant when hope failed. No genomic data can tell us whether the condemned had a sister in the crowd, or a child waiting somewhere beyond the gate, or a friend too frightened to speak. Stratigraphic excavation may uncover the stones of a tribunal, the paving of a street, the foundations of a gate. But the emotional architecture of sentencing is harder to find. Only imagination, disciplined by evidence, can approach it. The sentence was short. The consequences were vast. A living person stood before authority, heard words shaped by law and power, and passed from the world of ordinary suffering into the machinery of exemplary death. Rome had spoken. The crowd began to gather. The soldiers moved in. The body that had belonged to itself, however imperfectly, now belonged to the road, the wood, and the watching empire. Before the cross received the body, the whip often claimed it first. This was not a minor prelude. It was not a passing insult delivered in haste. The scourging could be a punishment in its own right, a brutal ceremony of pain that weakened the condemned before the final road began. In the Roman world, beating had many forms, from rods to lashes, from the disciplined violence of magistrates to the savage blows of soldiers who had grown familiar with suffering. The body of the condemned might be handed over still breathing, still capable of standing, yet already marked by the sentence. Then the scourge began its work. The place might be a courtyard, a barracks, a space near the tribunal, or a guarded area where the soldiers could complete their duty without interruption. The condemned was usually stripped or partly stripped, not merely to expose the back, but to increase shame. Wrists might be tied to a post, a ring, or an upright support. The arms could be raised, the shoulders stretched, the back drawn tight. A body in such a posture has little defence. It cannot twist away easily. It cannot protect the ribs. It cannot shield the kidneys, the shoulders, the thighs, or the neck. The whip turned human skin into a landscape of injury. Roman scourges varied. Some lashes were leather cords, others could be weighted with knots, bone, or metal, though the exact form depended on time, place, and circumstance. A simple whip could raise welts and split skin. A weighted lash could bruise deeply, tear flesh, and damage the small blood vessels beneath the surface. Repeated blows created overlapping trauma. The first stroke shocked. The second found the swelling. The 10th struck tissue already inflamed. The 20th might no longer feel like separate pain, but like the whole back opening into fire. The sound would have been unforgettable. Leather striking flesh, breath forced from the chest, the shift of soldiers' feet on stone or packed earth, the coarse counting, if anyone counted, the murmurs of those nearby, the wet change in the sound as skin broke and blood appeared. Ancient punishment was intensely physical. It was heard, smelled, and seen. Blood carried a sharp metallic scent. Sweat and fear thickened the air. Dust clung to open wounds. Flies gathered quickly in warm places where bodies were exposed. For the victim, survival began here. A body under the scourge must endure several disasters at once. Pain floods the nerves. Blood loss begins. Muscles spasm. The heart races. Breathing becomes irregular. The mind tries to flee, then returns violently each time the lash lands. Shock can creep in quietly. The skin grows cold. The face pales. Strength drains into trembling. A person may remain conscious, faint, return, and faint again. Soldiers accustomed to punishment could control the intensity, stopping short of immediate death if crucifixion still waited, or pressing further if the condemned was meant to be nearly destroyed. This balance was part of the cruelty. Too little beating and the spectacle might lack the desired terror. Too much, and the victim might die before the cross could do its public work. Executioners were not physicians, but experience taught them the visible signs of collapse, the sagging knees, the head hanging too heavily, the breath turning shallow, the skin losing colour. the blood spreading too quickly beneath the bound feet. They didn't need compassion to understand the body. They only needed practice. The scourge attacked more than the back. Blows could wrap around the sides, striking the chest and abdomen. They could land on the upper arms, buttocks, thighs, and legs. They could tear into areas needed for movement, making the later march a torment of its own. If the shoulders were injured, carrying timber became harder. If the legs were weakened, stumbling became likely. If the ribs were bruised, breathing already hurt before the victim was ever lifted from the ground. This mattered because crucifixion killed slowly through many pathways, and scourging opened several of them at once. Blood loss reduced strength. Dehydration began earlier when blood and sweat left the body under heat. Pain increased exhaustion. Bruised muscles became less able to support the posture required for breathing on the cross. Open wounds increased the risk of infection, though infection usually needed more time than the first hours to become the main killer. More immediately, the wounds invited flies, heat, dirt, and the body's own swelling response. Each factor made endurance harder, yet many victims survived the scourging. This is one of the terrible answers to the question of survival. Human beings can endure catastrophic pain without dying immediately. The body is fragile, but it is also stubborn. Skin may tear and life remain. Blood may flow and the heart continue. Consciousness may break and return. A victim might be reduced to shaking weakness, yet still be capable of being dragged, lifted, or forced forward. The Romans exploited this grim resilience. The condemned survived because the body does not surrender as quickly as mercy might wish. Under extreme stress, the body releases its own chemicals of alarm. The pulse surges. Blood is directed toward essential organs and working muscles. Awareness may narrow. Time may fragment. Some victims might enter a state of stunned detachment, feeling the blows as if from a distance, then being dragged back into agony by a sharper impact. Others might remain intensely aware, counting each stroke against their will, tasting blood in the mouth from bitten lips, hearing their own cries as if another person made them. There is no single experience of pain. Ancient sources rarely preserve the interior voice of the scourged, so we stand at the edge of silence. But the medical reality is clear enough. A severe flogging could leave the condemned alive and already dying. Rome understood the value of that condition. A freshly condemned prisoner still standing with defiance might disturb the intended hierarchy of the spectacle. A scourged victim, weakened and blooded, displayed the state's control more fully. The whip made resistance difficult. It prepared the body for transport. It also prepared the audience's imagination. By the time the condemned appeared in the street, blood had already told the crowd that the sentence was irreversible. The wounds were public documents. Every torn line across the back announced that the condemned had passed beyond ordinary protection. The skin recorded the authority of Rome more directly than any tablet of law. People could see pain even if they could not read. They could understand blood even if they did not know the formal charge. The scourged body carried its own inscription. For slaves, the whip had an even deeper meaning. The lash belonged to the daily grammar of domination. Enslaved people knew that beating could correct, threaten, punish, or destroy. Scars could remain for life, visible proof that the body had been subject to another's will. In this sense, scourging before crucifixion joined household power to state power. What a master could do on a smaller scale. Rome could magnify before the world. For rebels, the scourge served another purpose. It reduced the dangerous aura of courage. A rebel leader might inspire others while upright, speaking, resisting, refusing shame. The whip worked to strip that power away. It bent the posture. It covered the body in weakness. It made the heroic figure bleed like anyone else. It reminded witnesses that courage could be broken down into muscle, skin, breath, and pain. But even here, the machinery of shame could fail. Sometimes a victim's endurance turned horror into awe. A person who remained silent under beating, or who spoke with dignity while blood ran down the back, could disturb the meaning intended by the executioners. The crowd might still fear Rome, but it might also remember the condemned. This is one reason public punishment was never fully controllable. The state staged the drama, but human courage, pity, and memory could alter its meaning. Still, the scourge usually did what it was meant to do. It made the body heavy. It turned standing into labour. It made clothing stick to wounds, then tear away if removed. It caused thirst, dizziness, shaking, nausea, and weakness. It brought the victim closer to collapse while preserving enough life for display. It created a state of suspended destruction, neither dead nor whole, fit for the road that led to the place of execution. The scientific language of modern study gives structure to this ancient suffering, yet it cannot soften it. Osteological analysis may reveal trauma to bone, but scourging often damaged soft tissue that vanished long ago. Stratigraphic excavation may recover the floor of a courtyard, the post holes of a structure, or the debris of a military installation, but not the blood once washed from stone. Radiocarbon dating may place human remains within a Roman horizon, but it cannot count the lashes. Genomic data may identify ancestry or kinship among the dead, but it cannot tell us who cried out, who prayed, who fainted, who tried not to give the soldiers the satisfaction of a sound. For the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot know how many strokes a given victim received. We cannot know whether the executioner was bored, angry, obedient, amused, or indifferent. We cannot know whether the condemned saw the whip before feeling it, or whether the first blow arrived from behind like lightning. We cannot know whether a friend heard the screams from a nearby street and understood. What we can know is that the scourge was the first great theft of strength. It took blood needed for the struggle to breathe. It took skin needed to protect the body from sun and dirt. It took muscle steadiness needed for walking. It took dignity before the crowd had fully assembled. It took the ordinary boundary between inner life and outer world, opening the body so that punishment could be seen, and yet, again and again, victims survived it. They survived not because the pain was bearable, but because the human body can continue past the point where imagination refuses to follow. They survived because Rome had learned how to injure without always killing. They survived because the cross demanded an offering not of death alone, but of time. Time for the wounds to stiffen. Time for thirst to grow. Time for fear to deepen. Time for the body, already broken by the lash, to be led toward the wood. The road to the cross was part of the punishment. It was not enough for the condemned to be injured in a courtyard or sentenced in a hall of power. Rome wanted movement. It wanted the body carried through the living city, through the noise of trade and gossip, through the spaces where ordinary people could pause and understand that authority was passing in front of them, not as a law carved into bronze, but as a bleeding person under guard. The condemned did not usually carry an entire cross. The upright post could remain fixed near the execution ground, waiting like a dead tree rooted in the earth. What the victim often carried was the crossbeam, the heavy horizontal timber to which the arms would later be fastened. Even this was enough. After scourging, after loss of blood, after thirst, after terror, the beam became a crushing burden. Its rough surface pressed into torn shoulders, its weight dragged against balance, its splinters caught in skin, its smell of sap, dust, and old use would have filled the nose with every stumbling breath. Wood was not symbolic to the victim. It was mass. It was pressure. It was the physical future laid across the back. The crossbeam may have been tied across the shoulders or arms, forcing the condemned into a posture of helpless strain. Hands might be bound to it, making any fall dangerous. If the knees buckled, the face could strike stone or earth before the hands could break the descent. The timber might twist, slam into the neck, reopen wounds, or wrench the shoulders. Soldiers could pull the prisoner upright, curse, strike, and force the procession onward. The march turned exhaustion into spectacle. People along the route did not need to attend a formal gathering. The punishment came to them. A woman drawing water could look up and see the condemned passing. A child sent on an errand might remember the scene for decades. A shopkeeper might step from shade into sunlight. A traveller entering the gate might stand aside as soldiers cleared the road. The condemned moved through the city as a living announcement, and each witness became part of the message. In Roman thought, roads were arteries of empire. They carried legions, tax records and grain shipments, imperial letters, merchants, slaves, animals, and news. A crucifixion procession used that same network of movement. The road was not neutral ground. It belonged to Roman order. To force the condemned along, it was to show that every stone, every gate, every mile marker, every guard post stood on the side of power. The body on the road was already half removed from the community. A condemned person might pass familiar faces without being allowed to stop. Someone may have recognized him and looked away for safety. Someone may have whispered his name. Someone may have spat. Someone may have wept quietly, careful not to be noticed. The route magnified loneliness. A person could be surrounded by people and yet abandoned by the world. This loneliness was deliberate. Public shame depends on separation. The condemned had to be visible but not embraced, seen but not rescued, heard but not answered. Rome did not simply punish the individual, it instructed the crowd in how to behave around the punished. Keep your distance. Do not interfere. Do not join the condemned in sympathy too openly. Do not challenge the soldiers. Continue your life beneath the shadow of authority. The soldiers controlled the pace, too fast, and the weakened prisoner might collapse entirely, too slow, and the procession could become disorderly or invite gathering emotion. The execution squad had to manage the strange balance between spectacle and completion. They may have driven the victim with blows, but they also needed the body to reach the place of execution alive enough for the final display. In this way, even cruelty required a kind of practical knowledge. The crossbeam made every step unstable. Imagine the body after severe beating, the back torn and swollen, the skin hot with injury, the muscles trembling, the mouth dry, the head ringing. Now place across the shoulders a rough timber heavy enough to resist every movement. The weight pulls downward. The wounds protest with each jolt. The arms cannot swing naturally. The chest cannot expand freely. Balance must be found through hips, knees, and feet. But the legs are already weak. The victim walks not as a free person walks, but as a body being used by a punishment. Dust rises. It enters the mouth and clings to blood. Under a bright sun, the road becomes an oven of stone and glare. In colder weather, sweat chills against injured skin. Flies follow where blood has dried and reopened. The condemned may feel the beam not only as weight, but as certainty. With every step, the timber says what the court has already said. There will be no return. In some cases, the condemned carried a notice naming the charge. It might be hung around the neck, carried before the procession, or later displayed at the place of execution. Words became part of the theatre. Roman authority did not merely punish bodies, it named them. The victim was made legible to strangers, reduced to a crime, a warning, a category. This reduction was another form of violence. A person who had once been complex, with memories, fears, loves, habits, skills, and contradictions, became a public label. The road erased biography. To most witnesses, the condemned was not a whole life but an example. This is how empires simplify the people they destroy. They compress them into accusations. They make the crowd feel that the suffering has an explanation, and therefore a purpose. Yet the crowd was never a single mind. Some watched with satisfaction, some with horror, some with boredom, having seen such things before. Some were hardened by life in a brutal age. Others may have felt an inward rebellion that they dared not show. Children might ask questions adults answered in whispers. Slaves might look with a fear so deep it had no words. Soldiers off duty might observe with professional indifference. Priests, merchants, labourers, foreigners, and beggars all might stand within sight of the same procession, each reading it through a different wound in the soul. The condemned moved among them, carrying not only wood but meaning. For a rebel, the beam proclaimed defeat. For a slave, proclaimed ownership beyond death. For a bandit, it proclaimed the roads restored to Roman safety. For a deserter, it proclaimed the army's vengeance. For Rome, it proclaimed the restoration of that order. For the victim, it may have proclaimed only pain, thirst, and the narrowing distance to the place where breathing itself would become work. Falls were likely. Ancient streets could be uneven, crowded, slick with refuse, broken by steps or stones, crowded with animals and carts. Outside the gate, the road might become rougher, more exposed, edged by ditches, tombs, shrines, scrub, and open ground. A stumbling condemned person carrying timber had little chance to recover gracefully. The fall itself could reopen wounds, bruise ribs, split lips, break teeth, or drive grit into the face. Soldiers might lift the beam, drag the body, or compel another person to carry the burden if the victim could no longer move it. Such forced assistance did not lessen the punishment. It protected the spectacle. Rome wanted the condemned to reach the killing place. If another set of shoulders was used for part of the road, the logic remained the same. The victim still walked toward exposure. The crowd still watched. The sentence still advanced. The wood still waited. The city gate marked a threshold. Inside were houses, workshops, fountains, markets, temples, and the dense life of human settlement. Outside lay tombs, roads, fields, quarries, rubbish grounds, military spaces, and places of execution. To pass beyond the gate under guard was to leave the protection of civic belonging. The condemned crossed from the world of the living city into the outer zone where Rome placed the dead, the dishonoured, and the dangerous. Many Roman cities kept death near the roads, but outside the central life of the community. Tombs lined approaches to towns, speaking of family memory, status, and ancestry. A crucifixion ground among such roads created a grim contrast. Honoured dead rested beneath inscriptions, dishonoured dying hung above the dust. One form of display sought remembrance, the other sought warning. Both addressed passers-by. Both used the roadside as a theatre of memory, but one said, "Remember this person." The other said, "Fear this fate." By the time the condemned reached the execution place, the body had already spent much of its remaining strength. The road had drained what the whip had spared. Shoulders burned, knees shook, wounds stiffened. The tongue swelled with thirst. Vision might narrow and brighten at the edges. Hearing might become strange, with crowd noise fading in and out like surf. The beam that had seemed heavy at the start might now feel impossibly vast, as if the whole empire had been laid across the back. Still, survival continued. This is one more dark answer to how victims endured. They were not required to be strong in the way soldiers were strong. They only had to remain alive under compulsion. A person can be dragged when walking fails. A person can be struck back into consciousness. A person can be forced forward by fear when the body has little strength left. The will to live may remain even when the future contains only suffering. The instinct to breathe, to stand, to avoid the next blow, to move one more pace, or can keep a body in motion beyond all dignity. Roman cruelty exploited instinct itself. The condemned did not march because hope was reasonable. He marched because the body clings to life moment by moment, because pain commands movement, because soldiers leave no choice, because collapse brings more blows, because death has not yet arrived. And until it arrives, the body continues its ancient labour. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the last houses, the posts came into view. There may have been more than one, some old, darkened by weather and use, some newly prepared, the ground around them hardened by feet, the air open, exposed, without shelter, birds circling at a distance, insects already gathering, soldiers setting down tools, a small crowd arriving in curiosity, the city visible behind, close enough to remember, too far to save. The road had done its work. It had displayed the condemned to the world of the living. It had exhausted the body without ending life. It had transformed judgment into procession, and procession into public memory. It had carried a person from sentence to timber through the watching heart of Roman order. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No lithic analysis can weigh the exact beam placed on a specific shoulder. No stratigraphic excavation can recover each footprint in the dust of the final road. No radiocarbon dating can tell us which witness looked away, which one laughed, which one prayed, and which one never forgot. The stones may remain, the gates may be traced, the roadbeds may be uncovered, but the human passage across them has vanished into silence. Only the image endures, a wounded figure beneath timber. Soldiers walking close, a crowd dividing to let terror pass. The road stretching outward toward the place where Rome finished what its voice had begun. At the place of execution, the punishment changed from movement to fastening. The road had weakened the condemned. The scourge had opened the skin. Fear had burned through the mind. But now came the most intimate labour of Roman cruelty, the joining of living flesh to dead wood. The execution ground may have been a bare rise of earth outside a city gate, a roadside place where passers-by could not avoid the sight, or a cleared space near a military post. The upright stake might already have stood there, fixed deep into the ground, darkened by weather, dirt, and older deaths. Around it lay the plain objects of the executioner's trade: rope, iron nails, hammer, perhaps a ladder or forked tool, perhaps wedges or pegs, perhaps pieces of timber used before and used again. Nothing about these objects needed to appear grand. That was part of the horror. The instruments were ordinary: wood, rope, iron, muscle. A punishment that would enter the nightmares of centuries depended on materials found in workshops, ships, farms, and army stores. The cross was not mysterious in its construction. Its mystery lay in how something so simple could produce such complete human ruin. The condemned was forced down. This moment deserves stillness. For the victim, the ground itself might have felt almost like mercy after the road. To lie down meant the weight of the beam no longer crushed the shoulders, but that relief would have lasted only a breath. Soldiers moved quickly, arms were pulled outward, wrists or forearms were positioned against the crossbeam. The injured back touched rough timber or hard earth. Open wounds met dust, splinters, and pressure. The body, exhausted as it was, would have understood with animal clarity that the final restraint had begun. There were two principal ways to bind a victim to the cross: ropes and nails. Ropes could prolong life. They could hold the arms in place without the immediate trauma of iron-piercing tissue. A body tied securely might survive for a long time, especially if some support allowed partial relief of weight, but ropes were not gentle. They bit into skin, compressed nerves, stopped circulation, and became tighter as swelling increased. Bound arms grew numb, then burned, then lost strength. The victim could struggle, but struggle often tightened the restraint. Nails were different. Iron made the punishment sharper, more invasive, more unforgettable. The nail announced that the body was not merely held but penetrated. It passed through living tissue with a violence that left no room for misunderstanding. The strike of the hammer was not only heard, it was felt through bone, tendon, nerve, and wood. Each blow joined the body more completely to the instrument of death. Modern imagination often places the nails through the palms. Yet the palms alone may not have reliably supported the weight of a suspended adult body. The tissue could tear, the hand could rip free under strain, depending on position, support, and method. Many scholars therefore consider the wrist or the lower forearm a more likely place for secure nailing in at least some cases. There, between small bones and strong ligaments, the iron could hold, but such placement brought its own torment, for the region is crowded with sensitive nerves. A nail driven near the wrist could ignite pain down the hand and up the arm. Not dull pain, not distant pain, a bright, electric agony, as if lightning had found a pathway inside the limb. Fingers might curl, the hand might spasm, the arm might tremble uncontrollably. The victim could not pull away because the nail, rope, soldiers, and timber all held together in one system of force. The feet, too, had to be secured. They might be tied, nailed separately, nailed together, placed to the sides of the upright, or fixed in a twisted posture depending on local practice and the executioner's choices. The most famous archaeological evidence for Roman crucifixion comes from a heel bone pierced by an iron nail, discovered in a burial context from the Roman period. This rare find matters because crucifixion usually leaves little trace. Soft tissue disappears, wood decays, nails may be removed for reuse, bodies may be discarded in ways that leave no careful record, but a pierced heel bone gives the ancient texts a terrible material companion. The heel speaks without words. It tells us that the feet of the condemned could be fixed in ways that turned every attempt to push upward into torture. The victim needed the legs to breathe better, to shift weight, to relieve pressure on the arms and chest. But if the feet were nailed, every upward motion sent pain through the wound. If the feet were tied, the pressure and strain still punished movement. Either way, the body was trapped in a cruel bargain: remain still and suffocate more quickly, or move and awaken the injuries again. The fastening process required control. Several soldiers might hold one victim. One could pin an arm, another could arrange the limb, another could handle the nail, another could swing the hammer. The condemned might struggle with whatever strength remained, not because escape was likely, but because the body resists violation. Muscles pull away before the mind can command them not to. The instinct to protect the hand, the foot, the face, the chest, is ancient and powerful. Roman soldiers had to overcome that instinct with numbers, force, and practiced indifference. A body under restraint becomes both heavy and vulnerable. The victim might be lying on the crossbeam while the arms were fastened. Then the beam, with the body attached, could be lifted and fixed onto the upright post. This lifting was another violent transition. The arms, already tied or nailed, bore sudden strain as the body left the ground. Shoulders stretched, wounds pulled, the chest opened painfully. The weight of the torso dragged against the fastening points. If the beam dropped into a socket or a notch, the jolt could tear through the entire body like a second execution. The first moments upright must have been shocking. The world changed angle. The crowd lowered beneath the feet. The horizon shifted. The city, road, fields, tombs, soldiers, faces, sky, all entered the victim's vision from a new and terrible height. The body hung exposed, no longer moving through the world, but fixed before it. The arms pulled outward, the ribs strained, the back pressed or scraped against wood. Blood moved differently. Breath changed. Pain gathered from several places at once and became one immense fact. The cross had taken hold. Some crosses were tall, others low. A low cross could bring the victim close to faces, insults, animals, and dust. A tall cross made the body more visible from a distance. A low cross made degradation more intimate. Either form served the Roman purpose. Height was not always grandeur. Sometimes humiliation was stronger when the condemned hung close enough for mockers to look into his eyes. Ropes and nails also carried meanings beyond function. Rope suggested captivity, the binding of slaves, prisoners, animals, and cargo. Iron suggested finality, military power, and the hard craft of empire. Together with wood, they formed a vocabulary of possession. The condemned was not merely placed on the cross, he was attached to it, made inseparable from the punishment in the sight of all. Every fastening point became a centre of agony. Wrists or forearms burned and tore, shoulders strained, feet throbbed under pressure, the back pulsed from scourging, the head ached, the mouth dried, the chest struggled to find a rhythm. The body tried to solve the problem of pain by shifting weight, but each solution created another wound. More weight on the arms increased the pull through the upper limbs. More weight on the feet intensified the lower wounds. Arching the back scraped torn flesh. Dropping the head strained the neck. Lifting the head required strength. There was no neutral position. This is one of the reasons crucifixion could last while remaining unbearable. The body was not wounded once, then left alone. It was placed in a posture where survival itself renewed the pain. Breathing, shifting, swallowing, speaking, lifting, sagging. Each act had a cost. Even the smallest motion became part of the punishment. The famous hill bone reminds us how rare certainty is. For all the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, who may have died by crucifixion across Roman lands, archaeology has identified only a tiny number of possible or clear traces. This absence is not evidence that the punishment was rare. It is evidence that the poor, the enslaved, and the condemned often vanished from the burial record. They were not always placed in tombs where bones remained intact. They were not always mourned with markers. They were not always protected from scavengers or later disturbance. Stratigraphic excavation can reveal context, but context is fragile. A burial disturbed by later digging may lose its story. A nail removed in antiquity may leave no trace. A body tied with rope may show no unmistakable mark on bone. A victim whose hands were fastened through soft tissue might leave nothing the earth could preserve. Radiocarbon dating can help place remains in time, but it cannot name every violence. Genomic data can recover ancestry, kinship, and disease, but not the precise sound of iron entering wood beneath a soldier's hammer. Still, the evidence we have is enough to destroy any comfortable distance. The cross was not an abstract emblem in its own age. It was a device that turned anatomy against itself. Bones, nerves, tendons, skin, lungs, blood, and gravity all became collaborators in the sentence. Roman power did not need to invent new laws of nature. It only needed to arrange the body so that nature, hour by hour, became cruel. At the execution ground, the condemned may have looked down and seen feet no longer free to walk, hands no longer free to work, embrace, eat, pray, plead, or shield the face, arms no longer belonging to gesture or labour, but stretched into public helplessness. The body had been reorganised into a sign, and still, beneath the sign, the human being remained. The victim could feel wind across wet wounds, hear flies, smell dust, sweat, blood, and timber. See soldiers dividing tasks, adjusting equipment, perhaps laughing, perhaps silent. See strangers watching as if watching weather. See the road by which he had come. see the sky, enormous and indifferent. For the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the exact fastening method in every place. We do not know how often nails were used compared with ropes. We do not know which executioners preferred which techniques, or how regional custom shaped the posture of the condemned. We do not know how many victims fainted during nailing, how many screamed until their voices broke, how many held silence with a strength that startled even the soldiers. Only fragments remain: iron, bone, wood vanished into earth, texts written by the literate, a heel pierced long ago, a memory of cruelty preserved because some punishments are too terrible to disappear completely. The fastening was the moment when the sentence became architecture. The living body was built into the cross, not placed beside it, not symbolically associated with it. Built into it through rope, nail, weight, and pain. From that instant, every breath belonged to the wood, and every heartbeat continued beneath the gaze of Rome. Once the body was suspended, crucifixion entered its slowest and most terrible phase. The violence of the whip had been sudden. The road had moved forward. The hammer blows had arrived in dreadful sequence. But hanging on the cross changed punishment into duration. The victim was no longer being taken somewhere. No one needed to drag him, position him, or force his steps. The body had arrived at the centre of its torment, and now time itself became the executioner. At first, breath might still come in desperate bursts. The chest, pulled open by the position of the arms, could fill with air, but releasing that air and drawing the next breath required effort. The shoulders were strained outward, the rib cage was lifted and held in an unnatural posture. The diaphragm, that deep muscle beneath the lungs, had to work against the body's position, against pain, against exhaustion, against the dragging weight of the torso. The victim would soon learn a brutal rhythm. Sag down and the arms take the weight. Push up and the feet ignite with pain. Sag down again and the chest tightens. Push up again and the wounds answer. There was no rest within this rhythm, only postponement. Every breath became a decision made by flesh rather than thought. The body did not reason through the mechanics. It simply fought. Air was needed, so the legs pressed. Pain exploded, so the body sagged. Breath shortened, so the legs pressed again. The cycle could continue until strength failed, and when strength failed, the end drew nearer. The agony was not only in the lungs. Gravity pulled without mercy. Hanging by outstretched arms placed strain on shoulders, elbows, wrists, and the muscles of the upper back. If the arms were tied, the ligaments stretched and joints burned. If nails fixed the wrists or forearms, the fastening points became centres of continuous torment. Nerves carried pain in waves. Fingers might numb, curl, or tremble. Hands could swell. The arms could feel both aflame and distant, as if they belonged to another body. The shoulders may have partly dislocated in some victims, depending on position and method. Even without full dislocation, the strain would have been severe. Muscles exhausted by beating and carrying now had to bear the work of breathing and posture. The body was forced into a contest it could not win. It could only delay defeat. Then came thirst. Thirst under crucifixion was not ordinary thirst. It was the thirst of blood loss, heat, fear, open wounds, and relentless breathing through a dry mouth. The tongue thickened, lips cracked, swallowing became painful. The throat felt lined with dust. If the execution ground lay under the sun, dehydration advanced with cruel speed. Sweat left the body. Blood became harder to circulate. The heart worked faster. The head throbbed. Vision shimmered. A victim might beg for water. Sometimes liquid was offered, perhaps in mockery, perhaps as a practical measure to prolong consciousness, perhaps as a gesture from someone standing nearby. but even receiving fluid could be difficult. The head had to lift, the mouth had to open, the throat had to swallow while the chest struggled. A small swallow might bring momentary relief, yet the larger torment remained untouched. Exposure deepened the suffering. The Roman world knew fierce sun, cold nights, sudden wind, dust, insects, and rain. A crucified body had little protection from any of it. Clothing might have been removed fully or partly, increasing shame and vulnerability. Sun burned the skin, cold stiffened injured muscles, rain washed blood into fresh patterns and chilled the body, wind dried wounds and lips, dust settled into sweat and torn flesh, insects came early, flies gathered at blood, sweat, eyes, mouth, and open wounds. The victim couldn't brush them away. That helplessness, small compared with nails or suffocation, could still become madness. A fly walking near the eye, another at the nostril, another at the lip. The body, made for movement and defence, was denied even the smallest act of self-protection. This is one of the quiet cruelties of crucifixion. It stole the ability to respond. The crowd added another layer. Some watched briefly and moved on. Some stayed. Some mocked. Some measured the victim's endurance. Some may have used the scene for cruel humour, for moral instruction, for political warning, or for whispered grief. The condemned could hear fragments, sandals in dust, laughter, argument, crying, questions, soldiers talking among themselves. Human voices became part of the agony. The victim was not alone enough for privacy, yet utterly alone in suffering. Sound itself might change as weakness grew. At first, the victim could cry out with force. Later, speech required breath that the body could barely spare. Words might become fragments. Groans might become dry gasps. A person who wanted to answer an insult, call to family, pray, or proclaim innocence had to spend strength to do it. On the cross, even language had a physical price. The heart was under siege. Blood loss from scourging and wounds reduced the volume the heart could move. Dehydration thickened the crisis. Pain and fear drove the pulse upward. The body tried to preserve the brain and vital organs, but the posture worked against circulation. Swelling gathered in extremities. The legs and arms could feel heavy and distant. Dizziness came and went. Fainting might offer a temporary escape, but unconsciousness did not remove the body from danger. The lungs still needed movement. The heart still laboured. Some victims may have died from shock, others from exhaustion and respiratory failure, others from a combination of dehydration, exposure, traumatic injury, and collapse of circulation. Crucifixion did not always kill through one clean mechanism. It was a convergence of disasters. That was part of its effectiveness. It did not depend on a single wound. It made the whole body participate in dying. And still, many lived for hours. Some lived far longer. This survival was not evidence of lesser suffering. It was evidence of how cruelly the punishment exploited the body's endurance. The human organism is built to continue. It compensates. It redirects blood. It floods the system with stress responses. It clings to breath. It finds tiny adjustments to reduce one pain at the cost of another. In ordinary life, this resilience preserves us. On the cross, Rome turned resilience into an extension of torment. A small support could prolong the process. A peg, ledge, or seat, like projection, might allow the victim to shift weight slightly. Such a support did not make crucifixion merciful. It could make it worse by delaying death. It gave just enough assistance to continue breathing, just enough relief to prevent immediate collapse, just enough stability for agony to stretch from hour into hour. Survival became a trap. The body also faced the problem of heat and position. If the victim hung under open sun, The head and chest could overheat. Sweat could no longer cool effectively once dehydration advanced. If the air was cold, the body shivered, wasting energy it didn't have. The inability to lie down, curl up, seek shade, drink freely, or protect wounds meant the environment became part of the execution team. Rome did not need to invent the sun. It simply left the condemned beneath it. Animals sometimes threaten the dying and the dead. In certain places, dogs, birds, and scavengers might gather near execution grounds. Even if soldiers kept them away while the victim lived, their presence was part of the terror. The condemned knew what happened to exposed bodies. Burial was not guaranteed. Honor was not guaranteed. The boundary between dying person and carrion could feel horribly thin. As hours passed, the mind may have entered strange territories. Pain can narrow consciousness until only the next breath exists. It can also break time apart. Minutes feel vast. Memory intrudes. Faces appear inwardly. Sounds sharpen, then fade. A person may drift between terror, prayer, delirium, rage, and numbness. Fever from trauma may begin. Loss of blood may confuse thought. The sky might seem too bright. The crowd might appear unreal. The wood might become the whole world. Yet somewhere within that suffering, the instinct to live remained. The body lifted again. The lungs drew air again. The feet pressed though pain answered. The arms held though they trembled. The heart beat though it was failing. This is perhaps the darkest truth of survival under crucifixion. The victim endured because the body kept trying to save itself from a death that the punishment had already arranged. Each breath was a victory stolen from the cross, and each victory prolonged the sentence. Life, which should have been sacred, became the mechanism by which agony continued. Scientific study can describe these processes with careful language: respiratory distress, hypovolemic shock, traumatic injury, dehydration, exposure, neurogenic pain, muscular fatigue, circulatory collapse. Such terms help us understand, but they do not contain the full reality. No phrase can fully hold the experience of hanging alive beneath a public sky, while the body spends itself breath by breath. For the most part, secrets remain hidden. No stratigraphic excavation can recover the rhythm of a victim's breathing. No radiocarbon dating can measure the length of a final afternoon. No lithic analysis can illuminate the tremor in a hand fixed by iron. No genomic data can tell us whether one person endured silently while another cried out until strength vanished. Archaeology gives fragments, anatomy gives mechanisms, history gives context. But the inner landscape of suffering remains, in the deepest sense, unreachable. Still, the suspended body teaches us something terrible. Crucifixion did not simply kill. It occupied the space between life and death, and forced a human being to remain there. It made air costly. It made gravity hostile. It made the sun an enemy. It made thirst a blade. It made the crowd a wall of eyes. It turned survival into torment and endurance into the Empire's final triumph. The victim hung not in a single moment of pain, but in a widening circle of exhaustion, breath by breath, pulse by pulse, hour by hour, until the body that had fought so hard to live could fight no longer. How long could a person live on a Roman cross? The question sounds simple until one stands inside it. Ancient death rarely kept exact time. The condemned did not hang beneath numbered clocks. No physician stood nearby with a tablet, measuring pulse, breath, heat, and consciousness. The people who watched were not collecting data for future scholars. Soldiers wanted the sentence completed. Crowds wanted spectacle, warning, or closure. Families wanted a miracle, a mercy, or the courage to endure the sight. The victim wanted air. So the hours disappeared into memory. Some died quickly. Some endured with horrifying stubbornness. Some may have lived from morning into evening. Others, under certain conditions, could survive into the next day, or perhaps longer. Roman crucifixion was not one single mechanical event repeated identically across the empire. It was a family of punishments shaped by local materials, soldierly habits, the condition of the victim, the severity of prior beating, the climate, the posture, the method of fastening, and the intention of those in command. The central mystery is not merely why crucifixion killed. The central mystery is why death sometimes delayed. The answer begins with the body's uneven collapse. A human being can lose dignity long before losing life. A person can be unable to stand freely, unable to walk, unable to speak clearly, unable to control pain, and yet remain alive. The heart continues its work. The lungs continue their struggle. The brain clings to oxygen. The kidneys, muscles, nerves, and blood all enter crisis. But crisis is not always immediate ending. The body is not a lamp that goes dark when struck. It is a city under siege. Some gates fall early, some walls crack, fires begin, water runs low, messengers fail. Yet somewhere, deep inside, defenders continue to resist. This is how victims survived the agony, not with strength in any heroic sense, but with the ancient biological refusal of the body to surrender before the final systems fail. A victim who had been heavily scourged might die sooner. Severe blood loss changes everything. The heart must beat faster to move what blood remains. Blood pressure may fall. The brain receives less oxygen. The victim becomes dizzy, pale, weak, and confused. If the flogging tore deep tissue or damaged vessels, shock could advance even before suspension. Such a person might reach the cross already near death. The hours would be fewer because the body's reserves had already been spent. But another victim might be flogged less severely. Perhaps the soldiers wanted a longer display. Perhaps the local custom used fewer blows. Perhaps the victim was physically strong, young and accustomed to labour. Perhaps dehydration had not yet become extreme. Perhaps the weather was cool. Perhaps ropes were used more than nails. Perhaps a small support allowed partial rest. In such conditions, the condemned could remain alive much longer, not because the punishment was mild, but because the machinery of death had been adjusted toward duration. Ropes could change the timeline. A body tied to a cross might suffer terribly from compression, numbness, swelling, and respiratory strain, but it might avoid the immediate trauma of deep nail wounds. If the arms were bound in a way that distributed weight, and if the feet had some support, the victim could sometimes continue the cycle of rising and sagging for many hours. Such survival was not mercy. It was a longer sentence written through the same body. Nails could shorten or lengthen suffering depending on placement. A nail through the wrist or foot introduced trauma, pain, bleeding, and nerve injury. Yet if the nail held the body securely and the feet allowed a tortured form of pushing upward, it could keep the victim positioned for continued breathing. The iron did not necessarily bring quick death. It brought fixation. It made escape impossible. It turned every movement into injury, while still allowing the body to continue its fight for air. Posture mattered deeply. If the arms were stretched too high, breathing became harder and death could come faster. If the arms were extended more outward, the strain differed. If the legs were bent, twisted, or fixed to the sides, pushing upward became more or less possible. A victim who could push with the legs gained breath at the cost of pain. A victim unable to push would sag and suffocate more quickly. The executioners did not need anatomical textbooks to learn this. Repetition taught them what arrangements prolonged display. Climate also held power. Under a harsh sun, heat and dehydration accelerated collapse. A victim lost water through sweat, breath, and blood. The mouth dried. The heart strained. Confusion deepened in cold. The body burned energy trying to preserve heat. Shivering consumed strength. Rain could chill, but might also cool a fevered body. Wind could dry wounds and increase thirst. The execution ground was never merely background. Weather entered the sentence. Age and health mattered. A young labourer might endure longer than an older man weakened by disease. A soldier hardened by marching might resist collapse longer than a prisoner already starved. An enslaved field worker, accustomed to brutal conditions, might survive physically while suffering beyond expression. A malnourished captive might fail quickly. Infection, fever, injury, and exhaustion from imprisonment all shape the final span. The mind mattered too, though not in a simple way. Willpower cannot conquer crucifixion. No courage can make torn tissue whole or turn thirst into water, yet panic can waste breath and strength. Rage can drive movement. Prayer can steady rhythm. Despair can collapse posture. Determination can force the legs to push again when the body pleads to stop. The inner life of the condemned could influence endurance for a time, but eventually physiology ruled. Still, belief could transform the meaning of survival. A rebel who believed death would serve his cause might endure invisible defiance. A martyr might turn pain into witness. A slave might survive hour after hour not from ideology, but from the naked instinct not to vanish. A condemned parent might call inwardly to children. A deserter might curse the army. A bandit might think only of water. The body hung in public, but the mind suffered in private worlds now lost to us. Ancient observers sometimes noted that crucified people could take a long time to die. This mattered for practical reasons. If authorities needed death hastened, they had methods. Legs could be broken, preventing the victim from pushing upward to breathe. A spear or blade could be used. The body could be removed only once death was certain, depending on order and circumstance. The possibility of hastening death proves that the cross itself could be slow. The breaking of legs was especially terrible. The legs were not merely limbs. They were part of the breathing system on the cross. As long as the victim could push upward, even briefly, the chest might expand more effectively. Break the legs, and that possibility vanished. The body sagged. The arms bore more weight. The chest locked into deeper distress. Breathing became shallower, more desperate, and often fatally limited. What appeared as violence against the lower body was also an attack on the lungs. This reveals the cruel intelligence of crucifixion. The victim survived because the body found tiny ways to continue. It pushed, lifted, twisted, gasped, rested for seconds, then repeated. Executioners could lengthen or shorten life by allowing or removing these possibilities. Survival was not accidental. It could be manipulated. A small seat or support could also extend life. To the modern imagination, any support sounds like relief. But in the logic of crucifixion, relief could be sinister. A support beneath the buttocks or feet could prevent rapid collapse. It allowed enough weight shifting to preserve breathing, while keeping the victim exposed and helpless. The goal might not be comfort, but duration. A person supported just enough to live remained available to pain, thirst, insects, mockery, and fear. The body's internal sequence of failure varied. In one victim, traumatic shock may have led quickly to death. In another, respiratory exhaustion may have dominated. In another, dehydration and heat may have slowly undermined circulation. In another, heart failure may have followed prolonged stress. Some may have moved in and out of consciousness, each return bringing the world back with unbearable clarity. Some may have died in silence because no strength remained to cry out. Others may have spent their last breath on a word, a prayer, or a sound no one recorded. This uncertainty is important. History often prefers clean answers. It asks for one cause, one timeline, one mechanism, one diagram. Crucifixion resists this. It was not a single wound with a predictable clock. It was a system of suffering that allowed many roads to death. Its horror lay partly in that flexibility. Rome could adapt it to the body, the crime, the audience, and the desired lesson. A quick death could serve one purpose. A slow death could serve another. In times of unrest, slow public suffering warned more effectively. Along a road after rebellion, the sight of victims enduring for hours or days transformed a landscape into threat. Near a city, a day-long execution could attract witnesses from many neighborhoods. In a military camp, prolonged punishment could burn itself into the memory of soldiers. Duration was a political tool, yet prolonged survival also risked pity. A crowd may laugh at the beginning and grow quiet later. Mockery can weaken when suffering refuses to end. The longer a person hangs, the harder it may become for some witnesses to maintain the comfortable idea that the victim is merely a criminal. The body's persistence can recover humanity, a dry mouth begging for water, a head lifting weakly, a mother crying at a distance. These can fracture the state's intended message. Rome controlled much, but not every human response. This is another reason crucifixion remains so haunting. It was designed to degrade, yet suffering can create memory that power does not intend. A victim meant to be forgotten might become unforgettable. A punishment meant to shame might expose the cruelty of those who ordered it. The same long hours that magnified terror could also deepen compassion in hidden hearts. The question of survival therefore belongs to both body and empire. The body survived because flesh is stubborn, because breath fights for itself, because the heart continues under impossible pressure, because nerves scream without killing, because thirst weakens gradually, because exhaustion takes time to become final. The empire needed that survival because spectacle required duration, because fear needed witnesses, because public domination worked best when the condemned remained visible, living, and helpless, long enough for the lesson to settle. This is the darkest answer. Victims survived the agony because crucifixion was designed to exploit survival itself. It did not kill despite the body's resistance. It killed through that resistance. It made every attempt to breathe part of the torment. It used the will to live as fuel. It turned endurance, that noble human capacity, into an accomplice of punishment. For the most part, secrets remain hidden. No excavated bone can tell us whether a victim lasted 3 hours or 30. No radiocarbon dating can capture the length of a scream. No genomic data can measure courage, panic, thirst, or despair. Stratigraphic excavation may find the place where bodies were buried, but not the slow passage of time above the ground. The ancient clock of crucifixion was kept in breaths, and breath leaves no fossil. Only the question remains, how did they survive? They survived because the body fought for life. They survived because Rome knew how to make that fight hurt. The soldiers who carried out crucifixions were not shadows at the edge of the scene. They were central to it. Rome could pronounce a sentence as the soldiers made the sentence physical. They took the condemned from custody. They guarded the route. They controlled the crowd. They handled rope, timber, nails, and weapons. They watched for escape, interference, fainting, collapse, anger, grief, and disorder. They turned legal words into a body hanging beneath the sky. To understand crucifixion, one must understand the men trained to stand beside it. They were products of a military world where obedience mattered more than tenderness. Roman discipline was famously severe. The soldier learned to march under weight, build camps, dig ditches, raise walls, endure hunger, obey commands, maintain formation, and submit his own body to authority. In such a world, pain was not exceptional. It was instruction. It taught endurance. It punished weakness. It enforced order. A man who lived inside that system could become dangerously accustomed to the suffering of others. The execution squad may not always have belonged to elite Roman citizen legions. In many provinces, local auxiliary troops, attached forces, or soldiers drawn from different regions might perform such duties. These men stood between empire and subject population. Some may have despised the condemned. Some may have felt nothing. Some may have been bored. Some may have enjoyed their power. Some may have hidden disgust behind routine. History rarely preserves their faces, yet their hands are everywhere in the punishment. A crucifixion required practical coordination. Someone had to prepare the site. Someone had to ensure the upright post was ready or that timber could be raised. Someone had to bring the crossbeam, or make the condemned carry it until he failed. Someone had to keep the crowd at a useful distance. Someone had to strip the victim. Someone had to bind arms. Someone had to hold legs. Someone had to drive nails if nails were used. Someone had to lift the beam, fix it, check the body, and remain until death was certain. None of this happened by magic. The soldiers had tools, hammers, nails, rope, blades, perhaps pliers or ironworking implements for removing or adjusting fastenings. They had whips, staffs, spears, and short swords. They had water for themselves, food for themselves, and the hard entitlement of armed men performing state violence. The condemned had only his damaged body. The hammer deserves attention. It was not a ceremonial object. It was a worker's tool, brutal in its simplicity. In the hand of a carpenter it joined structures. In the hand of a soldier it joined flesh to wood. Each strike required aim, too shallow, and the nail might not hold. Too poorly placed, and the limb might tear. Too awkward, and the process might become inefficient. The soldier did not need refined medical knowledge. He needed enough experience to fasten a body securely. The sound of the hammer would have carried metal striking iron head, iron biting wood, a cry, another strike, another cry, or the sudden collapse of sound into breathless shock. Around the execution ground, people heard the construction of death. The noise had rhythm, almost craft. And that is one of the most disturbing truths. Crucifixion transformed killing into labour. For soldiers, repetition could harden feeling. The first execution a young man witnessed may have unsettled him. The second less so. The 10th might become unpleasant duty. The 100th might become routine. Human beings can adapt to almost anything, including horror. Armies depend on this adaptability. They train men not to collapse before blood. They normalize commands that would horrify civilian life. They teach the soldier to look at a suffering body and see a task. This does not mean every soldier was equally cruel. Some were likely savage. Some joked to conceal discomfort. Some took trophies or gambled for clothing. Some mocked the condemned to amuse their comrades. Some may have performed the work with a blank face and an inward wish to be elsewhere. Some may have offered a small drink or adjusted a rope not from mercy alone, but to prevent premature death. In an execution ground, kindness and cruelty could become difficult to distinguish when both serve the continuation of punishment. The division of spoils reveals the soldier's place in the scene. The condemned often lost his garments. Clothing in the ancient world had value. Cloth required labour. A cloak could be useful. A tunic could be worn, sold, or divided. For the executioners, the victim's belongings might become part of the informal economy of death. One man dies, another gains sandals, a belt, a garment, a few coins, a knife, a token. The world of the condemned is stripped and redistributed. This too was humiliation. The victim watched, if conscious, as the last possessions passed into other hands. A garment that had touched his skin might become a soldier's prize. A belt that once held tools might be tossed aside. The body was exposed while its coverings were assessed like property. Rome punished not only life, but ownership, privacy, and memory. Soldiers also managed time. Crucifixion could last longer than their patients. An execution squad had to remain at the site, especially if political tension surrounded the punishment. A living condemned person could not simply be abandoned in all circumstances, because friends might attempt rescue, enemies might mutilate the body, crowds might riot, or the victim might be removed before the sentence had completed its meaning. The soldiers became guardians of suffering. They waited. This waiting shaped the atmosphere. After the noise of fastening came the slower business of watching a person die. Soldiers might sit in shade if there was any shade. They might talk, gamble, eat, clean weapons, drink, or scan the road. The victim's groans became background. The crowd shifted. Hours lengthened. Duty settled into boredom. This contrast is almost unbearable. One person's final agony could unfold beside another man's ordinary conversation. Such boredom did not soften the cruelty. It deepened it. A punishment becomes more terrifying when those who administer it no longer need passion. Rage may burn out, hatred may falter, but bureaucracy and discipline can continue without emotion. Roman executioners did not need to hate the condemned personally. The machine of empire worked better when personal feeling was unnecessary. The soldier obeyed because the order existed. The cross stood because the system required it. The victim suffered because his suffering had been assigned. The soldiers were also visible representatives of Rome. Their armour, weapons, language of command, and formation communicated authority. In a province far from Italy, local people might rarely see the emperor, the senate, or the high courts, but they saw soldiers. The soldier's body carried the empire into the street. His shield, helmet, sword, and military belt made Rome tangible. At a crucifixion, that tangibility became intimate and terrifying. A spear point near the crowd said, "Do not interfere." A command shouted across the dust said, "This space belongs to us." A soldier at the foot of the cross said, "Rome remains until death is complete." The execution squad therefore guarded not only a dying body, but the meaning of the event. If the crowd became too sympathetic, soldiers could threaten. If mourners approached too closely, soldiers could drive them back. If mockers became disorderly, soldiers could control them. Roman order was not chaos wearing a uniform, it was structured violence, and the soldiers were its living frame. They knew the body well enough to recognize death. The end of crucifixion was not always obvious from a distance. A victim might hang motionless but still breathe shallowly. A head might droop in unconsciousness. A body might seem dead, then stir when air returned. Soldiers had to decide when the sentence had done its work. They might check breathing, responsiveness, or bodily signs. In some cases, they might hasten death with additional violence if required by orders or circumstance. Certainty mattered. A condemned person removed alive would mock authority. A body taken too early could create rumour, rescue, or confusion. Executioners therefore watched for the final transition, when pain no longer produced movement, when breath no longer lifted the chest, when the body became weight only. The soldier who had fastened the victim to the cross might also be the one to confirm that the cross had finished its task. There was skill in this, but it was a grim skill. The Roman soldier was not merely a warrior on battlefields of dust and bronze-coloured light. He could also be a technician of public death. He knew how to break resistance, how to force movement, how to secure a body, how to wait, how to deny rescue, and how to preserve order around agony. The grandeur of Rome, its roads, aqueducts, forts, walls, and inscriptions, rested in part on men willing to do such work, and yet the soldiers too were trapped in history's machinery. Some were far from home, some had joined for pay, survival, citizenship, or advancement. Some served under harsh officers. Some had seen friends killed in ambushes, rebellions, and frontier wars. Some had been brutalized by the same system that taught them brutality. This does not excuse them. It reveals the chain. Empires do not create cruelty from nothing. They organize ordinary human weakness, ambition, fear, obedience, resentment, and fatigue into institutions. The execution squad stood at the end of that chain. In the silence around them, one might hear the empire breathing. The condemned struggled above the earth. The soldiers waited below. The crowd learned its lesson. The road carried the story outward. The city continued eating, bargaining, praying, sleeping. The machinery of life resumed around the machinery of death. For the most part, secrets remain hidden. No stratigraphic excavation can recover the expression on a soldier's face as he raised the hammer. No radiocarbon dating can tell us whether his hand shook. No genomic data can tell us if he dreamed of the bodies he guarded. No surviving nail can identify the man who drove it, or whether he laughed, cursed, sang, or worked in silence. Military archaeology may recover camps, weapons, sandals, fort walls, and inscriptions. But the inner weather of the executioner remains mostly lost. Still, the outline is clear. Crucifixion required more than a cross and a victim. It required trained men who accepted the task, tools prepared for pain, discipline strong enough to outlast pity, and an imperial culture that turned soldiers into custodians of agony. At the foot of the cross, Rome wore a human face, not the face of an emperor carved in marble, not the face of a senator speaking in polished phrases, not the face of law written in formal lines. The face of Rome. There was a soldier under the sun, holding a spear, waiting for a wounded stranger to stop breathing. Around the cross stood the living. That fact may be almost as terrible as the cross itself. Crucifixion was not designed for solitude. It needed eyes. It needed rumour. It needed the shiver that passes through a crowd when pain becomes public, and no one knows whether to stare, speak, laugh, pray, or flee. Rome raised the condemned above the ground, but it raised them into a human circle, into a theatre made not of marble seats and painted masks, but of dust, soldiers, silence, and faces. The crowd was not one kind of crowd. There were the curious, drawn by interruption. They may not have known the condemned or cared about the charge. Something was happening outside the gate, beside the road, near the place where punishment gathered, and human beings have always been pulled toward the edge of disaster. They came because others came. They came because death, when made visible, becomes a dark magnet. There were the cruel, who found pleasure in the spectacle. Mockery was not rare in the ancient world. A condemned person, stripped of protection and marked by official disgrace, could become a safe target. The powerless mocked the more powerless. The frightened mocked the doomed to reassure themselves that they stood on the right side of authority. Insults rose from the dust like stones thrown without hands. A laugh could be a shield. A joke could say, "I am not him. I am not the one hanging there. I still belong among the living." There were the obedient who watched because Rome wanted them to watch. They absorbed the message without protest. They saw the soldiers, the timber, the wounded body, the accusation, the exposure. They understood the lesson in the way people understand thunder, not as philosophy, but as warning. The empire did not need every witness to cheer. It only needed them to remember. There were also the grieving. These are the figures most easily lost in the harsh light of public punishment. A mother at a distance, a brother with his face lowered, a wife unable to approach, a friend hidden among strangers, a child not allowed to come close or worse, old enough to see and remember. The condemned did not fall from the sky into Roman custody. He belonged to someone, or had once belonged to someone. Even a slave whose name vanished from records may have had companions, lovers, kin, neighbours, fellow workers, people who knew the sound of his footsteps and the habits of his hands. For them, crucifixion created a special agony. The beloved was visible but unreachable, alive but beyond rescue, speaking perhaps, but with breath too costly for ordinary words. The body was present, yet already claimed by the state. This is grief sharpened into helplessness. A private bond was forced into public shame. Love had to stand beneath soldiers and choose its gestures carefully. Too much emotion could be dangerous. In a tense province, the family of a rebel might fear drawing attention. A public cry could be read as sympathy with a condemned cause. A gesture of honour could look like defiance. Even asking for the body might require courage, status, timing, or permission. The Roman state did not merely kill the condemned, it disciplined those who remained, teaching them how small grief must become when power is near. Silence that was not emptiness. Silence around the cross could contain terror, anger, devotion, shame, calculation, and despair. A silent witness might be broken by pity, another might be hiding hatred, another might be protecting children, another might be praying inwardly. Public punishment always creates invisible histories. The official record sees a crowd. The human reality is 1,000 separate interiors, each carrying a different wound. Some witnesses would have been enslaved people. For them, the cross carried a meaning more intimate than politics. It spoke directly to the condition of ownership. A slave who watched another slave crucified could not easily place the event at a safe distance. The message entered the body. It said that disobedience could end not in a beating, not in sale, not in hunger, but in exposure under the sky while others passed by and learned from one's suffering. Such witnesses might later return to work, but the image would return with them, in kitchens, fields, workshops, mines, and sleeping quarters. The story could pass in fragments. He lasted until evening. He cried for water. He said nothing. His hands were nailed. His feet were tied. Soldiers laughed. His mother was there. Dogs came near. The road smelled of blood. In this way, crucifixion travelled beyond the execution ground. It entered speech, memory, warning, nightmare. Children present at such scenes would have learned the grammar of empire early. Ancient childhood was not always protected from violence. Children saw animals slaughtered, illness untreated, bodies prepared for burial, punishments performed, and wars damage in ways modern life often hides. Yet to see crucifixion was to see authority in its most naked form. The child learned that adults could be made helpless, that soldiers could touch bodies with impunity, that law could end in wood, that the road beyond the gate was not only for journeys, but for warnings. Some viewers may have felt moral satisfaction if the condemned was accused of murder, piracy, betrayal, or robbery. Victims of that crime or their kin may have watched with a feeling that justice had taken form. In a world without modern prisons, without distant penitentiaries hidden from daily life, punishment was often immediate, visible, bodily. Many ancient people believed public severity protected the community. To them, the suffering on the cross might not have seemed like cruelty alone, but like order restored. This does not make the punishment less horrible. It makes the society more comprehensible. Ancient people were not simple monsters. They lived in worlds where insecurity was constant. Bandits could make roads deadly. Pirates could seize ships. Slave revolts could terrify households. Armies could destroy towns. A harvest failure could bring hunger. A weak government could invite chaos. In such conditions, many believed fear was necessary. Crucifixion survived not only because rulers imposed it, but because enough communities accepted terror as a price of order. Yet acceptance was not universal. Some must have recoiled. Some must have looked at the body and seen not justice, but excess. Philosophers and writers in the Roman world sometimes described crucifixion with disgust, calling it the most shameful of deaths, a punishment too vile for respectable speech. Even among those hardened by hierarchy, the cross could inspire revulsion. There were limits, at least in language, to what some wished to contemplate, but revulsion rarely saved the condemned. This is one of history's coldest lessons. A society can find a punishment horrifying and still permit it. People can pity the victim and still go home. They can whisper that the sentence was too severe and still avoid the soldiers. They can weep and still remain powerless. The crowd's compassion, unless organized into resistance, becomes another silent witness. The public location of crucifixion also shaped memory. A death in a cell disappears into walls. A death beside a road attaches itself to landscape for months, perhaps years. People might pass the place and remember. There, a rebel died. There, 3 slaves were raised. There, a bandit begged for water. There, the soldiers kept watch. The site itself became a wound in the geography of the community. Even when the body was removed, the post holes, trampled ground, stains, discarded rope fibres, fragments of iron, and dark local memory could remain. Archaeology sometimes reveals places of punishment only indirectly. Stratigraphic excavation may uncover disturbed soil, human remains without formal burial, objects associated with military presence, or roadside context that suggest exposure and exclusion. But the crowd leaves almost nothing. Sandaled feet vanish from dust. Gasps vanish from air. Mockery leaves no pottery sherd. Grief leaves no inscription unless the grieving had power enough to carve one. Most did not. This absence should trouble us. The dead of crucifixion were often people of low status, and the witnesses who loved them were often low status too. The archive of empire preserves governors and generals more easily than mothers and field hands. Genomic data may one day identify kin relationships among remains, but it cannot reconstruct the moment when one relative saw another hanging and could not intervene. Radiocarbon dating can place a bone in time, but not a sob in the throat. The crowd's silence is therefore one of the largest missing documents of Roman history. Still, we can sense its shape. A ring of watchers under sun, soldiers near the base of the cross, a few bold mockers speaking loudly, others at the edges saying nothing, family members torn between nearness and danger, travellers slowing, then moving on, slaves looking once and lowering their eyes, children asking what crime had brought this, the condemned hearing all of it, or hearing less and less as weakness deepened, for the victim. The crowd may have been worse than pain in certain moments. Pain belonged to the body, but shame belonged to the gaze of others. To be watched while helpless is a deep violation. To be unable to cover oneself, unable to stand straight, unable to answer accusation, unable to turn away from hostile eyes, is to have the social self dismantled. Rome understood this. The cross killed biologically, but the crowd completed the humiliation. Yet the gaze of the crowd could also return humanity. A single face of pity might matter. A familiar voice might pierce the isolation. A woman weeping, a friend refusing to leave, a stranger offering water, a witness silently honouring the condemned against Rome's intention. Such gestures could not undo the sentence, but they could resist its meaning. They could say, "You are not only the crime they named, you are not only the body they displayed, you're still one of us." Perhaps this is why public cruelty always fears compassion. Compassion interrupts the lesson. It makes the warning unstable. It restores individuality where the state has imposed category. It turns spectacle back into suffering. It reminds the witness that the person on the cross is not merely rebel, slave, bandit, pirate, deserter, or criminal, but a human being trapped in the final extremity. Rome tried to control the crowd, but no empire can fully command the inner life of those who watch. Some went home afraid, some went home satisfied, some went home haunted, some carried the memory quietly for the rest of their lives, and perhaps, at night, long after the soldiers had left and the market noise had faded, a witness might still see the figure against the sky, arms stretched, head fallen, body moving slightly in the wind. Not a legal lesson now, not an imperial message, only a human being in pain. And the question that rises whenever civilization reveals its darkest face: what kind of order requires this? For the most part, secrets remain hidden. The crowd did not speak with one preserved voice. Its fear, mockery, grief, obedience, and pity have scattered like dust beyond the city gate. But its presence was essential. Without witnesses, crucifixion was only a method of killing. With witnesses, it became Roman power made visible, a lesson pressed into memory through the eyes of the living. The condemned hung in pain. The soldiers guarded the sentence. The crowd carried the punishment away. When death finally came, the cross did not immediately release its victim. The body remained. This was one of the last cruelties of Roman crucifixion, and one of the most important. Execution did not always end when breath ended. The corpse still had meaning. It could continue to warn. It could continue to shame. It could continue to belong, not to family or memory, but to the authority that had raised it above the ground. In many ancient societies, burial mattered profoundly. To be buried was not merely to be disposed of. It was to be gathered back into human care. The dead needed washing, wrapping, mourning, prayers, offerings, names, tombs, or at least the dignity of being placed away from scavengers and insult. Customs varied from land to land, city to city, household to household. But across the ancient world, one belief appears again and again. The body of the dead was not ordinary refuse. Crucifixion threatened that belief. The condemned might be left hanging beyond death, exposed to birds, weather, insects, dogs, and public contempt. The corpse became a second sentence. It told the living that even death did not guarantee peace. A person who offended the power of Rome could be denied not only life, but the tender passage by which the dead returned to earth. To modern minds, death often feels like a boundary. Beyond it, punishment should stop. The ancient world did not always agree. The dishonoured corpse could still be punished. It could be dragged, displayed, denied burial, thrown into pits, or left in places where animals completed what executioners began. In this harsh logic, the body remained socially active even after the soul, spirit, breath, or life force had departed. The cross therefore stood between execution and disposal. Soldiers might leave the body until they received permission to remove it, until the display had served its purpose, or until practical concerns demanded clearance. A festival, a local custom, a governor's decision, a family petition, or military necessity could change what happened. There was no single ending for every crucified person across the empire. Some were buried, some were dumped, some vanished. This uncertainty has haunted scholars for generations. The written sources show that crucified bodies could be denied honourable burial, especially in cases of rebellion, slavery, or public disgrace. Yet archaeological discoveries remind us not to make the rule too absolute. At least some victims did receive burial, perhaps because relatives intervened. Local customs mattered, officials allowed it, or circumstances softened the final disposal. Rome was often brutal, but it was also practical. It governed through general patterns, not identical outcomes. Here the earth becomes both witness and deceiver. A crucified person left to scavengers might leave scattered bones, damaged by animals and weather, mixed with soil, dragged from the original place of death, and later impossible to identify. A person thrown into a common pit might be found among other remains, without the marks needed to prove crucifixion. A person tied rather than nailed might show no clear skeletal injury. A person nailed through soft tissue might leave bone unmarked. A nail removed before burial might erase the strongest clue. This is why crucifixion is so difficult to find. It was a spectacular punishment in life, yet archaeologically quiet in death. Wood decays, rope disappears, iron corrodes, breaks, or is reused. Flesh vanishes. Bones survive unevenly. Soil conditions matter. Later construction disturbs graves. Looters scatter remains. Old excavations sometimes fail to record context with modern precision. The punishment that filled the air with terror can leave almost no signature beneath the ground. Stratigraphic excavation is crucial because context is often the only remaining voice. A bone by itself tells one story. A bone in a grave, within a burial ground, beneath a known layer, associated with pottery, coins, nails, or other dated material, tells a richer story. Stratigraphy allows archaeologists to read the earth as a sequence of events. Which layer came first? Which pit cut through another? Which stones were placed deliberately? Which objects belonged to the burial and which entered later? Without such care, the dead lose their last chance to speak. Radiocarbon dating can help place remains within a range of time, but it cannot identify crucifixion alone. A skeleton from the Roman period is not automatically a crucifixion victim. A nail near a bone is not automatically an execution nail. A damaged heel is not automatically proof of the cross. Every claim must be weighed carefully, because the desire to find dramatic evidence can tempt even modern minds towards certainty where only possibility exists. Good archaeology resists that temptation. It moves slowly. It asks what else could explain the evidence. It examines bone under magnification. It considers soil movement. It studies nail shape, corrosion, burial position, trauma patterns, and comparisons with known examples. It asks whether the injury occurred before death, at death, or after death. It asks whether the body was buried respectfully, hastily, carelessly, or violently. It seeks not legend, but patient reconstruction. The famous pierced heel bone remains powerful because it is rare and specific. An iron nail through the heel is not a vague symbol. It is a meeting of object and anatomy. It suggests a real body fixed to wood by real force. Yet even this discovery does not answer every question. It does not tell us the victim's final words. It does not tell us whether he was a slave, rebel, criminal. It does not tell us how long he lived. It does not reveal the crowd, the weather, the soldiers, or the family grief. It gives a doorway, not the whole house. A single nail opens the darkness, but the darkness remains vast. What happened to bodies after crucifixion depended on power and permission. If the condemned had relatives with influence, they might request burial. If local religious customs strongly required burial before nightfall, officials might allow removal, especially if public order benefited from accommodation. If the execution followed mass rebellion, bodies might be left to rot as a warning. If the victim was enslaved and no one claimed him, disposal could be careless. If soldiers wanted nails back, they might remove them, tearing the body further. If animals reached the corpse first, burial might never happen in any recognizable form. The removal itself was not gentle. A body hanging for hours or days stiffens, swells, dries, and changes. Blood settles. Muscles lose living tension, wounds darken. If nailed, the corpse had to be freed from iron, Nails could be pulled, limbs could be worked loose, bones might break, if tied. Ropes had to be cut or untangled from swollen flesh. The weight of the dead body, no longer resisting or helping, fell fully into the arms of those lowering it. One imagines the sound of it, the creak of wood, the grunt of men taking the weight, the thud of feet touching earth without life, the loosened rope falling into dust, the flies rising then settling again, the crowd thinner now, the soldiers bored, tired, ready to leave, the family, if present, waiting at the edge of permission. If loved ones received the body, a different world began. The execution ground, with its insults and soldiers, gave way to washing, wrapping, lamentation, and the careful handling of wounds. Hands that could not prevent death might still honour the dead. A mother might clean blood from a face. A friend might close the mouth. A brother might support the head. A widow might touch the hands that had been fixed in helplessness. Burial could not undo crucifixion, but it could reclaim the body from public meaning. This reclamation mattered. Rome had made the victim into a warning. Burial made him someone's dead, a named person, a mourned person, a member of a household, village, movement, or memory. Even a simple grave could resist the final intention of shame. To cover the body with earth was to say that exposure was not the last word. To mark a place, even without inscription, was to restore a fragment of human belonging. But many were not so fortunate. For the poorest, the enslaved, the rebel masses, and those abandoned by circumstance, there may have been no family hand to receive them. Bodies could be removed to pits, left in refuse areas, or disposed of with minimal care. Some may have entered the archaeological record as disarticulated fragments, anonymous bones without context. Others returned completely to the earth, leaving no trace that can be recognized. This absence is itself a historical fact. The people most likely to be crucified were often the people least likely to be preserved in honoured graves. The punishment targeted those already vulnerable, and the burial record continued that inequality. Marble tombs preserve the names of the powerful. Poor pits preserve little. Exposure preserves less. History then seems to belong to those who could afford memory. This is why each fragment matters. A pierced heel, a roadside burial, a nail found in context, a skeleton with unusual trauma, a grave cut into the earth of a Roman period cemetery. These are not merely finds. They are interruptions in the silence of the defeated. They remind us that behind every category stood a body, and behind every body a life that did not begin at the moment of punishment. Genomic data may deepen this human picture. It can reveal ancestry, kinship, disease burden, migration, and biological relationships among ancient remains. In certain cases, it may show whether individuals buried together were related, whether a person grew up locally or came from afar, whether the dead belonged to a mixed population shaped by empire's movement. Such information does not identify crucifixion by itself, but it restores complexity. The condemned were not abstractions. They came from families, regions, and lineages. They carried histories written in bone and blood long before Rome wrote its sentence. Material culture can also speak around the dead. Pottery near a burial may date a grave. Coins may suggest a period. Nails, if preserved, may reveal technology and reuse. Grave goods may show status or care. The position of the body may indicate haste or ritual. Soil chemistry may reveal decomposition patterns. Every detail matters because the cross itself is usually gone. The upright posts vanished. The beams vanished. The ropes vanished. The screams vanished. What remains must be read with humility. For the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know how many bodies were left in the open. We do not know how many families begged and were refused. We do not know how many soldiers cut down corpses without a thought. Or how many paused, even briefly, before the ruined body of a stranger? We don't know how many graves hold the crucified without marks that modern science can recognize. Yet the question of the body after death reveals the full ambition of crucifixion. Rome did not seek only to end life. It sought to control the meaning of the body while alive, while dying, and sometimes even when dead. The cross governed breath, the exposure governed shame, the disposal governed memory. But memory is not so easily commanded. A body left to rot could become a story of injustice. A denied burial could become a wound passed through generations. A grave granted after agony could become a place of devotion. A nail through bone could wait in silence for centuries, then rise from the earth and accuse an empire. In the end, the corpse forced a question that Rome could not fully answer. Who owns the dead? The state that condemned them? The soldiers who guarded them? The family that mourned them? The earth that received them? Or history, which comes late, kneels in the dust and tries to listen? Crucifixion did not end at the execution ground. It travelled. It travelled in rumour along roads where merchants lowered their voices at inns and caravan stops. It travelled in the speech of soldiers who had seen whole lines of victims raised after rebellion. It travelled in the grief of families whose dead had become public warnings. It travelled in the prayers of communities who tried to understand why heaven had allowed the righteous, the desperate, the enslaved, or the defeated to suffer beneath the open sky. No punishment belongs only to the body it destroys. A punishment becomes part of culture when people remember it, fear it, repeat it, justify it, condemn it, and build meaning around it. Roman crucifixion entered the memory of the ancient world because it touched the most fragile boundary in human life, the line between suffering and significance. In lands under Roman rule, revolt and crucifixion were bound together with iron logic. Rebellion threatened the empire's claim that its order was universal. It exposed the truth that conquest did not erase older loyalties. Villages still remembered local heroes. Priests still guarded ancient sanctuaries. Families still spoke of kings, laws, promises, lands, and gods older than Roman tribute. Beneath the smooth language of administration, anger often smouldered. Rome answered rebellion not only with battle, but with memory control. A defeated rebel on a battlefield could become a martyr in the songs of his people. A crucified rebel, stripped and exposed, was meant to become a warning instead. The cross attempted to seize the story at the moment of death. It said, "This is not a hero. This is not a liberator. This is not a chosen man of the gods. This is a criminal body under Roman judgment." But stories are unruly. A community could look at the same body and see something else. Where Rome saw sedition, the oppressed might see courage. Where Rome saw disorder, the faithful might see witness. Where Rome saw a defeated criminal, mourners might see a righteous sufferer. The cross tried to erase honour, but under certain conditions it created a deeper kind of remembrance. This was especially powerful in Judea, a land of fierce memory. There, history was not merely the past, it was covenant, promise, exile, return, temple, law, prophecy, and the expectation that the God of Israel judged empires as well as individuals. Roman power arrived in a place already dense with sacred meaning. Roads, hills, gates, fields, and stones could carry ancestral memory. To punish bodies that was never only political. It could become theological. Crucifixion in such a landscape did not speak into silence. It spoke into scripture, lamentation, hope, and rage. The Jewish people of the Roman period were not a single undivided bloc. Some cooperated with imperial structures. Some sought accommodation. Some pursued purity, learning, temple ritual, trade, survival, family, and local life under difficult conditions. Others resisted openly or secretly. Some looked for divine deliverance. Some followed prophetic voices. Some dreamed of liberation from foreign rule. Rome's cross entered this world as a sign of occupation. It was seen beside roads, outside walls, and in moments of crisis. It reminded the population that Roman authority could take a body and display it under the same sky where prayers rose to God. This made the punishment not only frightening, but offensive in a profound spiritual sense. It placed imperial violence in direct view of sacred longing. During revolts, crucifixion could become mass terror. A single cross was a warning. Many crosses became a landscape of defeat. When an empire raised multiple victims, it transformed punishment into geography. The road, the hill, the approach to a city, the fields near a besieged place, all could become crowded with bodies. The sight was meant to crush morale, to show that rebellion did not merely fail, but ended in exposure, thirst, carrion, and dishonour. Imagine a city under pressure, food running low, families hiding grain, walls watched day and night, priests and elders debating fate, young fighters moving through alleys with blades, stones, and desperate conviction. Outside, the besieging army waits with discipline, engines, trenches, standards, and time. Then the crosses appear, one body, then another, then lines of them. The defenders look from the walls and see not abstract danger, but the individual cost of resistance made visible. This was psychological warfare. The bodies of the captured were used to speak to the uncaptured. Each victim became a message sent back into the city. Do not continue. Do not hope. Do not imagine rescue. The empire has patience enough to make your death slow. Yet such terror could harden resistance rather than break it. A people who believe their struggle is sacred may interpret suffering differently from their conquerors. The more savage the punishment, the more monstrous the oppressor appears. Crucifixion could terrify, but it could also reveal Rome's cruelty in a form impossible to forget. A corpse on a cross could teach submission, but it could also nourish hatred, lament, and sacred memory. Here lies one of the great paradoxes of Roman power. The cross was designed to silence resistance, yet in some cases it gave resistance an image that could not be erased. Early Christian memory formed within this world of Roman punishment and Jewish hope. At its centre stood a crucified man. To outsiders, this was shocking almost beyond belief. A crucified figure was not an obvious foundation for honour. The cross signified degradation. It belonged to slaves, rebels, and the lowest condemned. To proclaim meaning in such a death challenged the social imagination of the Roman world. This was a paradigm breaker of the deepest kind. The Roman state used crucifixion to declare that a person had been rejected, shamed, and defeated. Early Christians proclaimed that divine purpose had moved through precisely that rejected body. The instrument of disgrace became a place of revelation. The victim whom empire had exposed became faith, victorious over empire's categories. The cross did not disappear as horror. Its horror was retained, but transformed. This transformation did not happen because people forgot what crucifixion was. It happened because they remembered. The terror gave the symbol its force. The shame gave the claim its audacity. To speak of salvation through a crucified one was not to choose a gentle emblem. It was to take the empire's lowest death and say that Rome had misunderstood the meaning of power. True power, the faithful claimed, might not look like command, spear, tribunal, and execution squad. It might look like suffering endured without surrendering divine purpose. For Roman elites, such ideas could seem absurd, offensive, or dangerous. A crucified man was not the sort of figure around whom respectable political and religious imagination gathered. The shame was meant to remain shame. The memory was meant to remain warning. Yet communities can preserve meanings that empires do not authorize. They can gather in houses, tell stories, break bread, pray, sing, and repeat the memory of a death until it becomes the center of a new world. Crucifixion also shaped language. Words of cross, bearing, shame, suffering, witness, and endurance took on expanding meanings. The physical punishment became moral vocabulary. People spoke of taking up burdens, of dying to the old self, of suffering with hope, of the weakness of the body and the strength of faith. A Roman instrument entered the inner life of communities, not as admiration for cruelty, but as a way of interpreting pain under history's harshest pressures. This is how memory conquers the intention of terror. Rome raised crosses to make examples. Communities retold crucifixions to make meaning. The state wanted the victim reduced to crime. Memory restored biography, faith, injustice, courage, or martyrdom. The official label could fade while the story survived. The accusation could be forgotten while the suffering became sacred. Not every crucified person became a remembered martyr. Most vanished. This must be said with care. For every name preserved, countless others disappeared into dust, pits, rumour, and silence. Slaves crucified after uprisings, bandits crucified along roads, captives crucified during wars, deserters crucified by commanders, poor provincials crucified without anyone powerful enough to write their names. The moral imagination of later ages often gathers around a few famous deaths, but the dark truth of crucifixion lies also in the multitudes who did not become symbols. Their anonymity is part of the crime. They suffered just as physically, they thirsted just as fiercely, their shoulders burned, their hands swelled, their lungs struggled, their families, if they had families nearby, grieved with the same helplessness. But no gospel, chronicle, inscription, or legend carried them forward. Rome intended many of them to vanish as warnings rather than persons, and history often obeyed. Archaeology tries slowly to resist that disappearance. Stratigraphic excavation can recover places where low-status dead were buried without monuments. Osteological study can identify trauma, disease, labour stress, and malnutrition. Radiocarbon dating can situate remains within generations of conflict and imperial rule. Genomic data can reveal that the anonymous dead belong to living populations, migration stories, families, and ancestries that crossed the empire's roads. These sciences cannot give every victim a name, but they can restore complexity to those whom power reduced. Material remains also remind us that memory is uneven. A grand temple may survive in stone while the body of a crucified slave leaves nothing. An emperor's face may endure on coins by the millions, while a rebel's bones scatter under animals. A governor's inscription may be found in a reused wall, while the cries of the condemned leave no mark. The ancient record is not neutral. It is shaped by wealth, status, preservation, accident, and excavation. Still, the cross remained in human consciousness because its cruelty was too severe to remain merely routine. People remembered it with dread. Writers used it as an image of ultimate shame. Religious communities transformed it into a symbol of suffering and hope. Moral thinkers later look back upon it as evidence of what empire can do when law and contempt join hands. The punishment that Rome used against the powerless became, in later centuries, a mirror held up to power itself. There is a strange justice in that reversal. The cross was meant to say, Rome decides what your suffering means. Memory answered, not always. The cross was meant to say, this body is dishonoured. Memory answered, perhaps this body reveals dishonour in those who raised it. The cross was meant to say, rebellion ends here. Memory answered, sometimes stories begin where empires believe they have ended. For the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the prayers spoken beneath countless crosses. We do not know how many witnesses became believers in a cause because they saw a victim die bravely. We do not know how many children grew into rebels because they once saw a parent displayed. We do not know how many communities carried names secretly when public mourning was forbidden. Only fragments remain, and yet the fragments burn. A punishment designed for slaves and rebels entered the spiritual vocabulary of nations. A method of humiliation became a symbol, debated, revered, rejected, carried, painted, carved, sung about, feared, and contemplated across centuries. The Roman execution ground became, through memory, one of the most powerful chambers of human reflection. The dark truth is not only that victims survived the agony. The dark truth is that the agony survived them. It outlived the soldiers. It outlived many magistrates. It outlived the wooden posts and rusted nails. It passed into revolt, religion, art, ritual, and conscience. The body died on the cross, but meaning did not. Meaning escaped into the mind of the living, where no execution squad could fully guard it. The cross did not remain Roman. This is one of history's strangest transformations. An object once meant to crush the identity of the condemned escaped the control of the world that made it famous. It passed from execution grounds into memory, from memory into worship, from worship into art, architecture, law, poetry, politics, and private grief. The wood that once stood outside city gates began to rise above churches, appear in manuscripts, hang from necks, mark graves, and glow in painted glass. No Roman executioner could have imagined it. To the men who drove nails and guarded the dying, the cross was a tool. To magistrates, it was a sentence. To governors, it was public order. To slave owners, it was warning. To rebels, it was terror. To the condemned, it was the place where the body fought its final battle against pain and breath. Yet across centuries, as the meaning shifted, it did not shift because the original horror vanished. It shifted because later communities placed that horror inside a new story. The cross became not merely the sign of suffering, but the sign that suffering could be confronted, remembered, and transformed. Its shame was not erased. It was reversed. What Rome used to degrade became, for millions, an image of endurance, sacrifice, redemption, and the mysterious nearness of the divine to the wounded body. This reversal is difficult to overstate. Ancient status culture despised the crucified. The cross belonged to the low, the defeated, the enslaved, and the condemned. Public honour moved in the opposite direction, toward triumphal processions, victory crowns, marble statues, ancestral names, military standards, and the dignified memory of great families. The crucified body had none of these. It had exposure, mockery, thirst, and flies. To take such a symbol and place it at the centre of sacred imagination was an act of astonishing defiance. It said that the lowest place might conceal the highest truth. It said that power measured by domination might be false power. It said that a suffering body could reveal more about the human condition than a conquering general. The transformation took time. In the earliest generations, the cross remained dangerous, shameful, and politically charged. Those who gathered around the memory of a crucified figure did so in a world where imperial punishment was still real. They were not handling a harmless emblem. They were invoking an execution method that many people found disgusting or absurd. The symbol had teeth. It still smelled of blood and dust. Gradually, as communities grew, the cross entered ritual life. It appeared in signs, gestures, stories, and teachings. It shaped how believers understood pain, persecution, forgiveness, humility, and hope. The physical instrument of death became a spiritual grammar. To speak of the cross was to speak of suffering born with meaning, of shame overcome, of violence exposed, of death answered by something deeper than death. Then came imperial change. When rulers who once belonged to the machinery of persecution began to favour the faith that remembered a crucified one, the cross moved again. It entered the language of state ceremony. It appeared in military symbolism, imperial patronage, public architecture, and sacred monuments. What had once been used by empire against the powerless now stood within empire's own imagery. This was both triumph and danger. The symbol of a victim could become the symbol of rulers. The scene of suffering innocents could be carried by armies. The memory of state violence could be absorbed into state power. The cross had escaped one meaning, but it could be captured by another. History does not move from darkness into light in a clean line. Symbols gather contradictions. They carry old wounds into new halls. And so the cross became layered. It was a sign of execution, a sign of faith, a sign of empire, a sign of resistance, a sign of mourning, a sign of conquest, a sign of consolation, a sign placed over the dead, and a sign carried by those marching to war. Few symbols in human history have held such opposing meanings at once. Part of this power comes from the body itself. The cross is not an abstract shape alone. It remembers arms outstretched. It remembers the vertical pull of gravity. It remembers exposure between earth and sky. Even when simplified into lines of wood, metal, stone, or ink, it still carries the trace of posture. A human form seems implied within it, even when no body is shown. This makes the symbol immediate. It speaks to the skeleton, to balance, to vulnerability. Art deepened this memory in painted panels, carved ivory, stone reliefs, illuminated manuscripts, mosaics, and later vast canvases. Artists returned again and again to the crucified body. At times they emphasized majesty, presenting the figure calm, robed, victorious, almost enthroned upon the wood. At other times they emphasized suffering, ribs visible, head fallen, wounds open, grief gathered below. Each age saw in the cross what it most needed or feared. During times of plague, famine, war, and social collapse, the suffering body on the cross could feel near to ordinary pain. The sick saw a body afflicted. The poor saw a body stripped. The imprisoned saw a body restrained. The grieving saw a body mourned. The oppressed saw a body condemned by power. The dying saw a body entering death before them. This is why the transformed cross endured. It did not ask people to pretend suffering was small. It placed suffering at the centre, then asked whether meaning might still live there. That question has followed humanity across battlefields, hospitals, prisons, ruined villages, execution chambers, and quiet rooms where one person watches another fade. Yet the cross also became a moral accusation, because it began as an instrument of cruelty. It asks uncomfortable questions of every age that displays it. What bodies do we expose? Whose pain do we ignore? Which condemned people do we reduce to labels? What punishments do we justify in the name of order? Which empires have we admired while forgetting the people hanging outside their gates? A symbol born from execution cannot honestly be made harmless. It should disturb. It should It should unsettle the comfortable imagination. Over time, the Roman practice of crucifixion itself faded from legal use, as the empire changed and as moral, religious, and political pressures shifted. The old punishment lost its formal place. The cross remained, but the execution ground receded. Ironically, the symbol survived more strongly than the punishment. The wood disappeared from the roads, but entered the mind of civilization. This too is a form of archaeological irony. The actual crosses rotted, the nails rusted or were reused, the bodies returned to earth. The execution places were built over, forgotten, cultivated, quarried, buried under later towns, roads, churches, and fields. Stratigraphic excavation may occasionally uncover hints of Roman violence, But the greatest survival of crucifixion is not material. It is symbolic. Material culture, however, reveals the transformation in another way. A shape once associated with shame appears on objects of devotion. It is carved into stone, worn on the body, painted in sacred spaces, pressed into coins, formed in metal, and raised above altars. The same basic geometry moves from roadside terror to intimate protection. A mother might touch it in prayer, a traveller might carry it for comfort, a mourner might place it over a grave. The symbol that once denied dignity now became a marker of dignity for the dead. That reversal is almost beyond Roman comprehension. Imagine a soldier from an early execution squad, hardened by provincial duty, suddenly seeing later generations gild the cross in gold, crown it with jewels, illuminate it in manuscripts, and lift it above domes. Would he laugh? Would he recoil? Would he understand that his tool of punishment had been taken from him by memory itself? Perhaps not. Empires often fail to imagine how the future will judge their instruments. The cross also influenced language beyond formal religion. To bear a cross became a way of speaking about burden. To crucify became a metaphor for public destruction, severe criticism, or moral outrage. The ancient punishment entered speech as a symbol of extreme suffering and exposure. Even when detached from its original mechanics, the word still carries a shadow. It remembers the road, the wood, the crowd, and the waiting. But there is danger in metaphor. When a word becomes familiar, the body behind it can disappear. Crucifixion can become a shape, a phrase, an ornament, a distant idea. The real victims vanish again. The slave under the sun, the rebel outside the wall, the bandit beside the road, the deserter under guard, the unnamed body whose bones left no trace. The suffering that made the symbol possible can become hidden beneath beauty. History must therefore return the weight to the word. The cross was once heavy timber. It cut shoulders. It held wrists. It trapped breath. It displayed shame. It delayed death. Only by remembering this can the transformation be understood honestly. The beauty later generations found in the cross was not born from comfort. It was born from the terrible claim that even here, in the place of abandonment, meaning could survive. For the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know how many early believers saw real crucifixions with their own eyes and carried those images into worship. We do not know how many artisans carved crosses while thinking of public executions still remembered by grandparents. We do not know how many grieving families found comfort in a symbol that had once terrified their ancestors. We do not know how many rulers used the cross sincerely, cynically, or both. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Perhaps new excavations will reveal more victims. Perhaps analysis of iron, bone, burial pattern, and ancient disease will sharpen our understanding. Perhaps genomic data will restore fragments of identity to the anonymous dead. Perhaps overlooked texts will show how communities spoke about crucifixion in ordinary life, not only in theology and law. Yet even without those discoveries, the great transformation stands before us. Rome created a punishment to humiliate the powerless. Memory turned it into a mirror in which power itself could be judged. Rome raised bodies to make people afraid. Later generations raised crosses to remember suffering, to seek mercy, to mark hope, to bless the dying, to honor the dead, and sometimes, tragically, to sanctify new forms of power. The cross transformed because human beings transform what wounds them. They carry terror into story. They carry grief into ritual. They carry shame into meaning. They take the instrument that said, "You are nothing," and answer, "No, even here, the human soul is not erased." That is why the cross remains, not because it is simple, because it is unbearable. What does the wood remember? Not in the manner of living memory, not with language, grief, or judgment. But in that older way, matter remembers: a scar in a beam, a stain in the grain, a nail hole darkened by weather, a splinter pressed into skin, a post standing in the open air while dust gathers around its base, and the empire that ordered it continues to breathe through roads, camps, taxes, and law. The wood remembers weight. It remembers the human form not as name or story, but as pressure, arms pulled outward, shoulders straining, feet searching for support, the slow shifting of a body that does not want to die. It remembers the movements that pain forced into rhythm, the rise for breath, the sag into exhaustion, the trembling return to effort. It remembers what Rome wanted everyone else to remember, that power could take the body and make it speak against itself. But the earth remembers differently. The earth receives what power discards. It takes the blood that falls. It takes the iron that rusts. It takes the bones that survive and the bones that vanish. It accepts the anonymous dead with the same silence it gives to kings. Beneath fields, roads, chapels, cities, and ruins, the earth keeps the long archive of those who were never meant to be honoured. There, in the patient darkness, empire loses some of its command. A magistrate may pronounce sentence. A soldier may raise the cross. A crowd may carry away the warning. But centuries later, all stand equal before excavation. Ruler, victim, witness, executioner. The trowel does not flatter rank. Stratigraphic excavation reads layers, not titles. Radiocarbon dating does not respect imperial pride. Genomic data does not ask whether a body was condemned or crowned. Bone chemistry, burial context, trauma analysis, and soil all speak in quieter voices than law, yet sometimes with greater honesty. History, at its best, listens to those quieter voices. It listens because the grand narratives of empire are always incomplete. Rome left arches, aqueducts, roads, walls, inscriptions, coins, legal codes, poetry, military camps, and cities whose stones still glow beneath the afternoon sun. These are real achievements. They deserve study. They speak of discipline, engineering, imagination, endurance, and administrative genius. But beside every road there is a shadow. The shadow of slaves who built and carried, the shadow of conquered peoples who paid tribute, the shadow of soldiers ordered to kill and die far from home, the shadow of prisoners displayed in triumph, the shadow of men and women whose bodies became warnings when order demanded blood. To tell the story of crucifixion is not to deny Rome's brilliance. It is to place that brilliance under the full light of human cost. Civilization is never one thing. It can raise libraries and crosses in the same generation. It can write philosophy while breaking bodies. It can construct aqueducts to carry clean water into cities, while leaving the condemned to thirst outside the gate. It can speak of law, virtue, duty, and peace, while teaching fear through public agony. This contradiction is not uniquely Roman. It belongs to humanity. Rome simply carved it at monumental scale. That is why the cross still unsettles. It asks whether order without mercy is truly order. It asks whether security purchased through humiliation corrodes the society it claims to protect. It asks whether a state can call itself civilized while deliberately stretching pain into public instruction. It asks what happens to the souls of those who watch suffering and become accustomed to it. These questions do not remain in the ancient world. Every age builds its own execution grounds, even when the wood has changed. Some are literal, some are legal, some are economic, some are hidden in prisons, camps, labour systems, public humiliations, and the quiet abandonment of the vulnerable. The ancient cross endures as a warning because it reveals a pattern. When a society decides that certain people are beneath dignity, cruelty soon becomes procedure. First comes the label: criminal, slave, rebel, foreigner, traitor, enemy. Then comes distance. The labelled person is no longer quite like us. Then comes spectacle or secrecy, depending on what power needs. Then comes the argument that severity is necessary. Then comes the habit of looking away. By the time the body suffers, the moral imagination has already been prepared. Rome understood this process with terrifying clarity. It made the condemned visible, but not fully human. It made the punishment public, but the victim's inner life irrelevant. It made suffering meaningful only as warning. It transformed a person into an example. That is the essence of cruelty organized by authority, not merely to injure, but to control the meaning of injury. Yet human dignity is stubborn. Even on the cross, the victim remained more than Rome's message. The body suffered, but it did not become only the sentence. The person remembered things the empire could not reach: a river from childhood, a mother's hand, the smell of bread, a field at dawn, a prayer, a friend's laugh, a promise, a fear, a hope without language. These inward territories were not visible to the crowd, yet they belonged to the condemned until consciousness faded. No empire owns the full interior of a human being. This is the quiet defiance history must preserve. The crucified were not merely victims of a method. They were people whose lives extended beyond their final posture. They had worked, desired, erred, loved, feared, believed, and endured long before Roman law found them. Some may have committed terrible acts. Some may have been innocent. Some may have fought for causes later judged noble. Some may have been desperate, brutal, confused, faithful, or broken. The cross flattened them into a category, but history must resist that flattening. The darkness of crucifixion lies not only in pain, but in reduction. A whole life reduced to a charge, a body reduced to a warning, a death reduced to public order, a memory reduced to silence. Archaeology pushes back, fragment by fragment. A heel bone pierced by iron says, this happened to someone real. A burial context says, someone handled the dead. A roadside grave says, the condemned did not always vanish. A skeleton bearing the marks of labour says, life before death was also heavy. A trace of ancestry in genomic data says, this person belonged to a human lineage, not merely to an imperial file. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the names of most victims. We do not know how many hours they endured. We do not know how many prayed to gods now forgotten, or how many cursed Rome until breath failed. We do not know how many were mourned in whispers. We do not know how many bodies were carried away by family hands, and how many were left to birds beneath a reddening sky. Only fragments remained, and fragments require humility. The past is not a theatre built for our certainty. It is a ruined landscape of evidence, silence, accident, and interpretation. We enter it carefully, aware that every confident reconstruction stands beside unknowns. Still, the work matters. To study crucifixion is to restore weight to a word too easily spoken. It is to remember that agony has anatomy, law has consequences, and empire has bodies beneath its stones. And perhaps that is the final legacy of Roman crucifixion. Not only horror, not only warning, but a demand that we look directly at the human cost of power. The cross stands at the edge of history like a black tree against the sky. Around it move soldiers, crowds, mourners, rebels, slaves, governors, priests, and travellers. Above it passes the sun that shone on all of them without distinction. Beneath it lies the earth that would one day receive them all. Rome wanted the cross to teach fear. History can make it teach something else. It can teach vigilance. It can teach pity. It can teach that no law, no empire, no army, no crowd, and no accusation should be allowed to erase the dignity of the body in pain. It can teach that civilization is measured not only by what it builds, but by whom it permits to suffer and how easily it learns to watch. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Perhaps more bones will rise from the soil. Perhaps more nails will be found in silence. Perhaps new methods will reveal the hidden biographies of those Rome tried to reduce to examples. But even now, enough remains for reflection. The wood remembers weight. The earth remembers the dead.